Britain's most famous monarch, King Arthur, legendary commander of the Knights of the Round Table, armed with the mighty sword Excalibur.
We'll never tire from hearing the stories of King Arthur.
His name is a byword for honor and courage.
He's a legendary figure, a war leader par excellence.
In the 20th century, two archaeologists set out in search of King Arthur's bones. One was a scientist driven by the facts, who risked ridicule and isolation in his quest.
Here is a man that flies in the face of received wisdom.
The other was obsessed by the supernatural.
What Bligh was doing was increasingly odd.
It was a journey that took them into the darkest part of England's dark Middle Ages. This is the story of the quest for King Arthur's grave. King Arthur is one of the most famous characters in the history of the British Isles. According to legend, his spectacular reign dates to the 6th century AD.
The popular image of King Arthur is of a knight in shining armour with a round table, heroic knights who go on quests, especially for the Holy Grail.
King Arthur is truly the stuff of legend. There's the famous story of the young Arthur drawing the sword from the stone, and his many magical adventures with the wizard Merlin. But the real King Arthur is shrouded in mystery, because the 6th century was at the heart of the Dark Ages. Few facts about this period of history are known. The peoples of Britain were under attack by foreign invaders. According to legend, King Arthur was their defender and champion. But his story ends with a valiant death in battle.
Arthur wins a whole series of battles before being fatally wounded in a climactic last battle with his arch-enemy.
Arthur is mortally wounded, and he's then taken to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds, and that's the last we hear of him.
The Isle of Avalon was the greatest mystery of all. No one knew where Arthur's last resting place actually was.
I think most contemporary scholars would doubt that in historical terms there ever was an Avalon.
But in 1191, 600 years after Arthur's death, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey in the west of England made a stunning discovery. They found King Arthur's grave.
This must have been one of the most celebrated discoveries, well, was the most celebrated discovery of the Middle Ages.
The grave contained a lead cross, identifying the bones as King Arthur's.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon."
The monks of Glastonbury believed their own abbey was Avalon itself. The mystery of King Arthur's death seemed to be solved.
There really was a King Arthur. We've got his tomb exactly in the same way as we've got the tombs of other famous kings.
But for modern historians, it was impossible to tell whether the monk's story was true. because in 1539, Glastonbury Abbey was totally destroyed by Henry VIII in his power struggles with the Catholic Church. All traces of King Arthur, his bones, and the cross that marked his grave were apparently lost. By the 20th century, scholars were left with no hard evidence that there ever was a real King Arthur.
There's a lot of scepticism about whether King Arthur really existed or did any of the things ascribed to him.
There is nothing that would confirm the existence of a historical figure called Arthur.
But in 1908, there was one man who firmly believed that King Arthur was real. And not only that, he set out to prove it. The brilliant architect, Frederick Bligh Bond, believed that only he could track down King Arthur's last resting place, somewhere in the shattered ruins of Glastonbury Abbey.
The only way we can actually prove whether King Arthur existed, or indeed disprove it, is by tangible archaeological remains.
If you could find a fragment of Arthur's tomb, then your reputation as an archaeologist would be made.
Bligh Bond convinced the Abbey's owners, the Church of England, to allow him access to Glastonbury. But he would still have to prove his credentials.
I think this was too good an opportunity for him to miss. Here was this almost virgin site, remarkably little work is done on it. He's the man to step forward.
In the early 1900s, the science of archaeology was in its infancy. Bligh Bond would use his architectural skills to make the first systematic search of Glastonbury Abbey. But only a few ruined walls remained. So the first step in Bligh Bond's quest was to fill in the gaps, to make a detailed plan of the Abbey as it once was.
Bond is, in effect, making a map. He actually stayed on site each day. He took measured drawings of what was found. Now this, of course, sounds very, very basic to our ears today, but this was something that most of his contemporaries simply didn't do.
The magnificent Abbey had several major buildings, but if Bligh Bond could map them out, then the historical records gave him a tantalizing clue where Arthur's bones could be found. After finding the grave, the monks had been anxious to display Arthur's remains to important visitors. So they put them in pride of place, at the center of their largest and most important building, the Abbey Church.
They were brought out in 1278 to be presented to two very interested visitors indeed, King Edward I and his wife, Queen Eleanor of Castile. So they paid for a tomb of black marble to be set out in the middle of the Abbey Church.
The story should have led Bligh Bond straight to King Arthur's tomb. But with the entire site in ruins, the location of the Abbey Church was far from clear. Bligh Bond's problem was to somehow map out its missing walls, then find the tomb at the center. And to find the solution, he would rely on his lifelong fascination with mathematics.
His first love really is mathematics, and especially mathematical puzzles, numbers, correspondences.
Bligh Bond believed the builders of Glastonbury Abbey had used a secret mathematical code. His measurements showed that the layout of the Abbey followed a deliberate number pattern. It had been handed down by architects since biblical times.
According to his measurements, there seemed to be repeating numbers and patterns which were coming out, and these were more than coincidental, but seemed to be a foundation plan, a foundation geometry.
Bligh Bond knew that ancient builders often used number patterns called magic squares. Every square has 6 rows and 6 columns. But to crack the code, Bligh Bond had to find a way to fill in the rows and columns so that they all added up to the same number. He made hundreds of attempts to find the right pattern, until finally he had the solution. The secret magic number was 111. Bligh Bond was convinced that he knew what it meant. 111 multiplied by 8 makes 888 inches, or 74 feet. He believed he had discovered the secret. The ancient builders had laid out the abbey on a grid of 74-foot squares.
Bligh comes to the conclusion that he's discovered the medieval laying out plan of Glastonbury Abbey.
Bligh Bond decided to prove his credentials by putting his map to the test. He would reveal the Abbey's lost buildings one by one. Acting on his instructions, his workers dug a trench, exactly 74 feet long. They immediately hit the foundation stones of an entire chapel that no one else knew was there. It had been missing for nearly 400 years. But Bligh Bond's map had predicted its location. The lost chapel exactly filled the last square of 74 feet.
Bond called it the Lost Chapel because it was the only significant addition to the abbey of which there was no surviving trace. Nothing remained above ground. It was something of a test for Bligh, if you like.
One of England's greatest archaeologists said the Lost Chapel had never even existed. But Bligh Bond uncovered it within weeks. He had even predicted its eventual size.
Bond hit foundations, followed them to the east and discovered a very large 4-bay building, thus proving one of the leading archaeologists of the day wrong.
The church authorities were dazzled. This was a man who could predict exactly what he would find before he even started digging.
The discovery of the Lost Chapel, if you like, very clearly marked Bond out as an archaeological force to be reckoned with. Large numbers of visitors came to the abbey, including people like the Bishop of Bristol, who even commented, "How are you doing it? You know, you don't seem to be wasting a spadeful of earth."
The Lost Chapel was the first square to be filled in on Bligh Bond's 74-foot grid pattern. His excavations soon revealed that the much larger Abbey Church, the last known location of King Arthur's tomb, was also a perfect fit to his master plan. The huge building was 1 square wide and 5 squares long. Bligh Bond knew exactly where to dig for Arthur's bones, right in the center of the church.
When he's got all that information, then he measures out on the ground and puts his spade into the turf.
If Bligh Bond's calculations were correct, then the marbled tomb was about to be revealed. And he soon found what he was looking for. Telltale chippings of the distinctive black stone. These were the last remnants of the tomb which had been smashed by King Henry VIII in 1539. If Arthur's remains had also survived, they had to be somewhere nearby. But to Bligh Bond's utter disbelief, his workers couldn't find a single fragment of bone. For all his ingenuity, Bligh Bond's search for King Arthur had failed. And at this major setback, his church paymasters started to question his strange obsession with numbers.
There was nothing fundamentally unorthodox about what Bond was doing with number at all. It was just highly unusual.
To the church establishment, magic squares looked like numerology, a practice they connected with the paranormal, even Satanism.
It all sounded extremely dubious. Eyebrows were raised, questions were asked at committee meetings.
The church's patience was running out, and Bligh Bond needed results, fast. His new plan was to look for the actual grave where the 12th century monks had found King Arthur's remains. It would be one last chance to find any bones the monks had left behind. But Bligh Bond's map was now useless. The grave could be anywhere in the Abbey's grounds. A total area of 220,000 square feet. To track it down, Bligh Bond was ready for desperate measures.
Bligh is so convinced by his work with symbolic number, and he so desperately wants this to be true that he oversteps the mark.
Bligh Bond turned to the occult. With the help of a psychic named John Bartlett, Bond planned to communicate with the dead. Their séances used the paranormal technique of automatic writing.
They would take out a couple of sheets of clean white paper, they would sit down comfortably, and they would either ask a question into the air or alternatively write a question at the top of a piece of paper. Bartlett would put a pencil in his hand and put his hand on the sheet of paper. Bligh would then take his right hand and put it on Bartlett's left hand in which he was holding the pencil. And after a few hesitant movements, Bartlett's hand would start to write, and scrawl would proceed across the page.
The writing seemed to be guided by an unseen power. For Bligh Bond, it was electrifying. The monks of the ancient abbey were telling him their secrets.
He literally believes in the spirits of medieval monks. Much to Bligh's surprise, a lot of the personalities do seem to be remarkably helpful. In fact, they egg him on. You know, you should dig further, you should look here, you should look there.
A monk named Johannes was the most anxious to be heard. He encouraged Bligh Bond's obsession with mapping out the abbey.
They were interested in mathematics and geometry as well. Bligh gets quite fond of Johannes and often asked for him if he was talking to a different personality.
Totally gripped, Bligh Bond begged for the location of King Arthur's grave. And Johannes had a shocking revelation. There was another, much older church, far beneath the abbey soil. In the search for Arthur's bones, Bligh Bond would have to dig deeper into Glastonbury's Dark Age past.
The very oldest part of Glastonbury Abbey was called the Old Church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. It was extremely ancient, and nobody was quite too sure how old it was or who was the original builder.
According to Johannes, the site of the Old Church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel, which Bligh Bond had already located on his map. King Arthur's grave was just outside in the ancient cemetery. Bligh Bond realized he could use his mathematical knowledge to track it down.
So he thinks to himself, if the same ground plan has been used through the centuries, we can project backwards in time, exploring the geometry and the buildings, to find the form of the very first church.
Bligh Bond mapped out his search zone around the old church. Still obsessed by the number 6, he formed a hexagon. The cemetery and King Arthur's grave had to be somewhere within the symbolic shape. When his excavations began, Bligh Bond could hardly believe his eyes. There were bones everywhere. He had found the ancient cemetery, filled with centuries of the abbey's inhabitants. It was only a matter of time before he identified the grave of King Arthur.
He was quite convinced that he had discovered the original gravesite of Arthur and Guinevere, and that if he had had the season to dig, he would have been able to excavate the original grave cut.
But now, Bligh Bond made his greatest mistake. In 1918, he published a book called The Gate of Remembrance. It detailed his paranormal investigations at Glastonbury Abbey and revealed his séances with dead monks. The news spread like wildfire through the Church of England.
As you can imagine, this created something of a stir. The accusation was that Bligh wasn't an objective architect and archaeologist. How could he be? And that it wasn't Bligh who was director of excavations, but in fact it was the personalities of medieval monks that were actually directing what was going on site.
In the eyes of the church, Bligh Bond was flirting with the devil, not Christian archaeology. The clincher for them was that 6 rows of 111 make 666. The number of the beast.
This is the moment which the excavations are closed down and his services are no longer required.
Bligh Bond's quest for the bones of King Arthur was over. The horrified church shut down the excavations. In 1923, he was banished from the abbey for good. But a new Arthurian hero was already waiting to take up the quest. In 1908, the excavations at Glastonbury Abbey had been visited by a highly inquisitive 8-year-old boy. From the very start, he seemed destined to take up the quest for King Arthur. His name was Arthur Raleigh Radford, and in Bligh Bond, he found a charismatic mentor.
It seems highly likely that Bligh made quite an impression on the young Radford.
The boy was thrilled by Bond's fantastic stories of ancient monks and a legendary king.
Bligh always used to be the circus master when he took people around his excavations. Excavation work, that was his love, that was his passion, and that came across in everything he did. And that's the sort of thing that I would have thought that would appeal to a young mind.
There and then, young Radford decided to find King Arthur's grave. A quest he would follow for his entire career as the leading archaeologist of Dark Age Britain.
He'd been obsessed by the idea that the Arthurian past had had some archaeological reality.
But Radford had little time for Bligh Bond's paranormal methods. He was very much his own man, careful, logical, and systematic. A skeptic who wanted solid evidence above all else.
One of the things that Raleigh Radford has going for him is he isn't a dreamer. He's not guided by hidden forces or anything like that.
Radford was an extremely serious, earnest scholar. Very critical and very methodical.
He was a proper archaeologist. He wasn't chasing shadows.
But even Radford couldn't get permission to dig at Glastonbury. The Church of England was still wary after its experience with Bligh Bond. So Radford switched the focus of his search from the place of King Arthur's death to the place of his birth. 100 miles from Glastonbury, on the windswept Isle of Tintagel. The setting for the fantastic story that started King Arthur's legend. The story goes that King Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, had fallen in love with the Duke of Cornwall's wife.
The Duke of Cornwall realised what was going on and so whisked his wife back to Cornwall and put her in the most secure location he could find, Tintagel.
Believing his castle was safe, the Duke made the mistake of leaving his wife at home. But Uther found a miraculous way to gain access.
The answer to an impossible task was to get Merlin the magician.
Merlin worked his magic. He transformed Uther into the exact likeness of the Duke, and he walked straight into the castle unopposed.
Uther Pendragon took the opportunity to sleep with the Duchess of Cornwall, disguised as her husband, then leave in the morning, and then catch up with the real Duke of Cornwall and kill him.
According to the legend, King Arthur was the result.
It was on that very night that King Arthur, the most famous of men, was conceived.
Few archaeologists took this legend seriously. But Radford himself was intrigued by the specific mention of Tintagel. He believed there had to be some reason why the legend was set on the island.
It seems reasonable to suppose there's no smoke without fire. He was pretty sure that following these legendary Arthurian associations could lead you to genuine 5th and 6th century sites.
Radford thought that Tintagel must have been part of a real 6th century Arthurian kingdom. And he planned to prove it with hard archaeological evidence. But he risked making himself a laughingstock. No other archaeologist believed the island had even been inhabited in the 6th century.
When Raleigh Radford started digging at Tintagel, scholarly views were that there was no Dark Age presence on Tintagel at all.
Radford set out to prove them all wrong. By digging deeper into Tintagel's past than anyone had before. He revealed a hidden Dark Age world. Rectangular buildings, laid out like a religious settlement.
He thought he'd identified there a series of characteristics which showed that the site was in fact a 6th century monastery.
Digging into the ruins, Radford found evidence that could precisely date the monastery to King Arthur's 6th century. It was a special type of pottery that had never before been found in Britain.
Here's, I think, a really fascinating element in the discoveries that Radford made at Tintagel, that the pot shards, the pieces of pottery that he was turning up in vast quantities, were not locally made.
The pottery came from the Eastern Mediterranean. It proved that Dark Ages Tintagel was not just a monastery, but an international trading post.
During the 5th and 6th centuries, Tintagel was plainly in contact with traders bringing Eastern Mediterranean imported pottery.
What he's discovered is a sophisticated 6th century world.
Radford called his pottery Tintagel ware. It showed what everyone else thought was an empty island had in fact been a thriving community.
Radford's discovery of imported Mediterranean pottery at Tintagel in the 1930s was a turning point for the archaeology of 5th and 6th century Britain.
There he was, uncovering, with spade work, absolute tangible evidence of this wealthy, sophisticated, international cosmopolitan world in Dark Age Britain. It was absolute groundbreaking, pioneering stuff from a man who absolutely knew what he was doing.
By following up on the King Arthur legend, Radford had proved something that no one else had even suspected. Tintagel had been part of a thriving 6th century Britain, just like the legends of King Arthur had described. Radford believed he had uncovered King Arthur's kingdom. Now he wanted evidence of King Arthur himself.
All it will now take is the opportunity to start digging at sites connected with the rest of the legends of King Arthur.
Radford was ready for Glastonbury Abbey and the mystery buried somewhere beneath its ancient ruins. In 1951, the church authorities finally gave him permission to excavate. Now all he had to do was find King Arthur's grave. Radford tackled his task like a master detective. He would make a detailed forensic analysis of the key eyewitness account from the 12th century.
What really happened outside Glastonbury Abbey in 1191.
The medieval monks had called in a historian named Gerald of Wales to verify their find of Arthur's grave. Radford planned to put Gerald's evidence under the microscope. Exhibit A was King Arthur himself. Gerald of Wales described his bones as those of an imposing warrior.
He describes how large the shin bones were, how large the eye sockets of this great heroic leader. You can imagine him probably standing 7 foot tall in his stockinged feet.
For Radford, the vital clue was a deep wound in the skull, exactly matching King Arthur's fatal battle wound as described by legend.
The body had several wounds to its head, mostly healed, but the last one, the major wound, was unhealed and presumably had been what had killed him.
Exhibit B was very different. The skeleton of a woman, with long hair still clinging to the skull. It was Queen Guinevere.
One of the monks was so overcome with romantic enthusiasm that he got hold of the hank of hair, which unfortunately then turned to dust.
Finally, Exhibit C, a lead cross identifying the skeletons as King Arthur and his wife. Gerald had copied down its ancient inscription.
When they came to look at the inscription on the lead cross, they read it as saying, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon with his second wife, Guinevere."
Gerald was sure the monks had found King Arthur's grave. But Raleigh Radford had reason to be sceptical. After the destruction of Glastonbury Abbey, all three key pieces of evidence were now missing. And Radford had to consider another, very different interpretation of Gerald's story. The find of King Arthur's grave could have been an elaborate fraud.
There have always been rumours of skullduggery, of deliberate falsification of the evidence. It is absolutely possible that monks could have hoaxed the whole discovery. It really is a kind of medieval scene of the crime mystery.
The monks' motivation for fraud would be financial gain. They were trying to prove they had the rights to their land.
You have to remember that Glastonbury Abbey was one of the biggest landowners in the country back in the 12th century. It was now up to the monks to try and justify why they had all that land.
With King Arthur's body in their possession, the monks could argue that he had granted them a royal charter.
And it could be seen as a seal of approval, a confirmation of some of those charters, if they could find King Arthur's burial.
So at face value, the discovery of King Arthur's grave was suspiciously convenient. Gerald of Wales could have been the unwitting victim of the monks' deception.
They could have found a convenient body and shown it to Gerald of Wales. He was very much the kind of person you'd want to have as a publicist, and he was specifically invited over to Glastonbury Abbey to talk to the monks and look at their discovery.
The inscription on the lead cross, as recorded by Gerald, was the most damning evidence of all. Modern archaeologists had dated the style of the lettering to the 12th century, exactly as if the monks had faked it.
They can create something which, in the context of the time, is a plausible forgery. Can monks really be trusted? Who knows?
Radford was the only archaeologist who believed the monks were telling the truth. He thought the lettering could be much older than the 12th century, and that the cross itself had been genuine. But to prove that Gerald's story was true, Radford had to find the only piece of evidence that was still in existence. The grave itself, still buried somewhere in the Abbey's oldest cemetery. But thanks to Frederick Bligh Bond, he knew exactly where to start his search.
Raleigh Radford had the big advantage that he could follow up the work of Bligh Bond. That gave Raleigh Radford a very good ground plan for the kind of places he was going to have to be digging if he wanted to find King Arthur's tomb.
Radford focused his excavations around the Abbey's old church, the Ecclesia Vetusta. The same place where Frederick Bligh Bond had been digging 40 years before, guided by the spirit of the medieval monk Johannes. But Radford planned a much more scientific approach. Peter Point's right, an archaeologist on the team, was fired by his enthusiasm.
He was an inspirational character, there with you all the time.
Urged on by Radford, the team dug deeper into the Abbey's ancient cemetery. But they faced the same challenge as Bligh Bond, to somehow identify Arthur's grave amongst many. Radford's vast experience gave him an ingenious way to solve the problem.
His depth of knowledge was, it oozed out everywhere.
Radford's research had uncovered a key historical detail. The site of the old church was now occupied by the medieval Lady Chapel. King Arthur had been buried south of the third window. His grave was directly in between two gigantic pillars.
One was 26 feet high, and one was 19 feet high.
The pillars were stolen after the abbey was destroyed. But Radford thought monuments this size must have left some trace behind. He planned to dig a 60-foot trench to find them.
We worked out where we thought the site was.
The trench took weeks of careful excavation, but then came the breakthrough. The pillars that once marked Arthur's grave had left gaping holes in the ground.
That gave the exact location, almost X marks the spot, for where he would have to start digging.
Directly between the holes, there were clear signs of disturbed earth. It was an empty grave, exactly where Radford said it would be.
The sort of area you would respectfully put a body into the ground.
Radford and Points Right soon found more proof that they were digging in the right place. Tiny chippings of stone showed the 12th century monks had also been in the grave.
And they'd been digging down in exactly the same spot.
In 1191, when the monks dug up Arthur's grave, the abbey was under reconstruction. The local building material, Dolting stone, was everywhere. Radford found that some of it had gone into the grave. It was a clear indication that at the time of the building works, the grave had been open.
There was the building chippings from the Ladies' Chapel that was being put up at that time, got down the hole when they'd made the disturbance.
The hole that they'd made had gradually filled up with these chippings as though it had been backfilled.
The stone chippings proved that the monks had definitely dug up the grave in 1191. But their story could still have been a hoax. Radford needed further evidence that the original grave was even older than the 12th century. And when he examined his trench more closely, he found it. There was a foundation wall designed to contain packed earth, and Radford soon discovered its purpose in the abbey's historical records. Long before 1191, the 10th century abbot of Glastonbury had raised the level of the entire cemetery to venerate its famous occupant.
And he could see that St Dunstan, or Dunstan the abbot of Glastonbury in Anglo-Saxon times, had been reorganising the graveyard at a higher level.
Arthur's grave had been dug up and reburied long before the monks of 1191 rediscovered it. Radford was sure the lead cross came from this 10th century reburial. It was put in the grave to make sure King Arthur was still properly marked. The 12th century monks hadn't faked it.
His theory was this was something which had been made between the time of King Arthur and the discovery of Arthur's grave in 1191.
With evidence to show that the 12th century monks had been telling the truth, Radford was ready to go public. He gave an interview to the BBC.
The monks said that they found in the coffin a leaden cross with a Latin inscription which says, "Here lies Arthur, the famous king in the island of Avalon." That has been dismissed as a forgery. In my view, on the basis of the lettering and the form of the cross, it dates not from the late 12th century, but from the 10th century.
If Radford was right, then the monks really had found King Arthur, the king who had founded their church in the 6th century.
It was traditional in the 12th century to put the founder of your church, your monastery, in a great tomb in the choir. And I have very little doubt that that's what they intended to do.
Radford thought quite definitely that this was the grave from which the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere were removed.
Radford was sure the account by Gerald of Wales was true. The monks had dug up a grave. Radford had found it. It really did happen in 1191. The stone chippings said so. The cross identified King Arthur, and Radford could show it wasn't a fake. There was only one piece of evidence he couldn't find: Tintagel-ware, to prove that King Arthur's original burial was in the 6th century.
Radford used imported Mediterranean pottery as the key indicator for sites of the 5th and 6th centuries.
It was one of the few things he didn't find on that excavation. It could well have been that those Tintagel-ware fragments had once been there and gone, but the truth was he hadn't found his smoking gun.
Radford knew his evidence was all circumstantial. There was nothing to link the grave directly to King Arthur.
This is where I excavated in 1962 and 63 and found the great hole from which they dug out someone.
Someone?
Well,
Arthur?
I think it was Arthur, but of course I can't prove it.
Radford never did prove the existence of King Arthur. But even at the age of 90, he was still visiting sites like Tintagel, still hoping for that conclusive final piece of missing evidence. He died in 1998, still on his quest.
Personally, I'm very much on that side of Raleigh Radford. He must have been persuaded there was something behind these Arthurian legends.
But Radford's story has a final twist. A decade after his death, archaeologists reassessed his finds at Glastonbury Abbey. They discovered that Radford had in fact found Tintagel-ware in the Abbey grounds. Radford never knew it, but he had proof all along that Glastonbury dated back to the 6th century. While most experts still don't believe in King Arthur, Radford was convinced this would have been the heart of his Dark Age kingdom. A fitting last resting place for Britain's greatest legend. (1863). Desperate men head to Arizona. They wanted gold.
They had to have some real grit to make this to survive.
Legend has it, one man struck it lucky.
This is the richest gold ore he's ever seen in his life.
He went by the name of the Dutchman.
He finally had something that he was the only one that knew where it was, and he was going to keep that secret.
It's a tale of greed, duplicity, and cold-blooded murder.
When it comes to gold, people will lie.
They say when he died, he took the location of the mine with him to his grave. Dick Holmes and his only son would spend their whole lives hunting for the gold. Their relentless quest became one of the greatest legends of the old Wild West. The search for the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. The story starts on a stormy night in 1884. 19-year-old Dick Holmes was joined at his campfire by a passing old-timer.
Dick Holmes and his father had a ranch in the Bloody Basin country, it's called. One day, when his father was away and Dick was taking care of the place, this man named John Pipps shows up, asks for shelter, Western hospitality.
What would pass between the two would define the rest of Dick's life.
Pipps is drying out from the rain, and he starts to tell the story about an old man that he'd seen in the Superstition Mountains. And this old guy appeared to be mining. After he left, Pipps went over and checked it.
It was the richest mine Pipps had ever seen. He told Dick it contained seams of gold ore 18 inches wide. With the keeper of the mine out of the way, Pipps began helping himself.
And then one day, the old guy came back, almost caught Pipps, scared the bejabbers out of him. Pipps felt lucky to get out of there alive.
In spite of the danger, teenage Dick was gung-ho to go get the gold.
Dick Holmes, he has the exuberance of youth, and he starts pumping Pipps for information, and he gets really excited, and let's go get the mine. And Pipps just clams right up.
To safeguard the headstrong youngster, Pipps remained tight-lipped. But Dick never forgot the tale of the dangerous old-timer and his fantastically rich gold mine up in the mountains. Dick Holmes was born in Arizona in 1865, when the West was at its wildest. He grew up near a small but rapidly growing settlement called Phoenix.
By the time he was 5, 6 years old, this town was full of miners, soldiers, Indian fighters. That was a time of Indian wars here. So Dick grew up in rough times.
During the 1863 gold rush, prospectors descended on Arizona. Some hit it rich, but others blundered into the homeland of the fearsome Apache, led by the legendary Geronimo.
You could easily be attacked by small to medium-sized parties of Indians. And one of the big worries was on the foothills of the Superstitions, not in the mountains themselves, because as you come across that open desert, the Apache would swoop down out of the mountains.
In 1875, at the tender age of 10, Dick Holmes signed up to fight the Apache. The youngster helped run supplies to beleaguered army outposts. Later, he enlisted as a cavalry scout and fought with distinction in skirmishes such as the Battle of Cane Springs.
Anybody that was out here in that time period, they had to have some real grit to make this to survive. Yeah, it wasn't for the meek, let's put it that way.
Back in Phoenix, Dick Holmes noticed one old prospector who stood out. He looked like all the other down-at-heel miners, but unlike them, this old-timer had no problem paying for supplies. Dick made discreet inquiries and discovered the man was called Jacob Waltz, but went by the name of the Dutchman. Word was he always paid his way, and he did it with gold ore.
Anybody displaying gold ore in a small town, well, you know what it's like in a small town. Everybody knows everybody else's business.
When the storekeepers assayed the old man's ore, they were staggered. It was 30% pure gold.
So if you have a rock the size of my fist, and it's quartz and gold, and 1/3 of it's gold, that's awful rich gold.
The storekeeper saw it, and the other customers saw it. Half a dozen people saw it in a small town. How do you keep that secret?
There's hundreds of stories that he squandered a lot of money, that he was a drunk and he threw all that. I don't believe any of that. He lived a very frugal life.
Dick saw straight through the Dutchman's impoverished old-timer act. He was sure the old man had struck it rich and he recalled the story he'd heard around a campfire. Pipps had talked of an old man in the mountains who jealously guarded a gold mine full of high-grade ore. Dick thought Jacob Waltz surely had to be that violent old prospector. Holmes put 2 and 2 together, and it all added up to one old Dutchman.
Waltz had the habit of leaving town for extended periods of time during the winter. Nobody seemed to know where he went, and the rumors were it wasn't a good idea to try to follow the old guy.
But Dick was determined to follow Waltz, even if it meant heading into the Apache Badlands, high up in the Superstition Mountains.
Dick Holmes decides that he'll keep an eye on Waltz and that he can figure out just about when he's going to leave by what purchases he makes in town. And that's exactly what he does, and Waltz leaves just like Dick thought. And Dick takes out after him.
Dick tracked the Dutchman's trail for 3 days and 3 nights, but was careful to keep his distance. Waltz may have been an old man, but going it alone into Apache country clearly didn't worry him.
You got to realize his history. He traveled out here from California with this big prospecting party. They were tough as nails.
By sunup of the 4th day, the 2 men were approaching the mountains. Now Dick hoped he'd soon catch a glimpse of the mine that could make him fabulously rich.
He can see Waltz's fire, the camp in the distance. But Waltz is doing in those days what they called shooting the back trail, which is you get up, you turn around, and you wait to see if you're getting followed. And Dick Holmes walks right into the trap.
Dick was braced for a belly full of hot lead. But then the unexpected happened.
The Dutchman told him, don't do that anymore, I'll kill you.
Having slapped Dick down, Waltz carried on his way up to the mountains.
Holmes was a very young man at the time, and I think the Dutchman simply wrote that off as a dumb kid stunt.
Dick headed back to town, with his tail firmly between his legs. Waltz had saved Dick from a date with the preacher, but Holmes wasn't giving up on the gold. Dick now continued his investigations into the Dutchman. He had always presumed Waltz a loner. Then he overheard a curious tale. It concerned an unusual figure in the man's world of Arizona in the 1880s. Julia Thomas was a woman. She was black, and she ran her own business, an ice cream and oyster parlor on Washington Street.
Waltz was a German immigrant. Julia Thomas spoke German, and he becomes very good friends with Julia.
The ice cream parlor was a big hit in the desert town, but then disaster struck. Julia's German husband, Emil, walked out on her. He took almost everything, apart from the debts.
Somehow, she finds her way out of debt. And in the court proceedings, it makes it quite plain that people are kind of amazed she was able to do this. You check the records, you can't find where she got the money. Legend says that Waltz helped her out.
Dick was convinced that Waltz must have given her some of his gold ore to clear her debts. He now became deeply worried. Might the old man also leave her the whole mine? And then in February 1891, things became even more alarming for Dick. A massive flash flood hit Phoenix, sweeping away half the town, including Waltz's house. The deluge left the old man sick and homeless.
Then after the flood, she comes to his rescue.
Julia took Waltz in and cared for him in the back room of her store. Dick knew the old man was dangerously ill. Would he now reward his nursemaid by shooting his mouth off about the mine? Dick was well and truly out in the cold. Then suddenly, in the early hours of October the 24th, 1891, his luck changed.
Early in the morning, he took a turn for the worse. It was obvious he wasn't going to recover.
Dick made his move. He rushed over to offer help.
Julia Thomas came outside, recognized Dick, and asked if he would sit with Waltz for just a few minutes. She's going to go get the doctor. Well, she doesn't show up for about an hour.
Dick now had the Dutchman where he wanted him. All he had to do was to get the old man to spill the beans.
Dick Holmes had followed Waltz before. He knew about the mine. Here's his golden opportunity to get the final directions.
But excitement soon gave way to mounting frustration.
He's with him for an hour. And probably 45, 50 minutes of that hour were taken up with Waltz talking about the history, how he found the mine, people he'd killed, and taking pauses. And Dick's just sitting there going, get to the directions.
The Dutchman, it appeared, had other things on his mind. He seemed determined to clear his conscience and give Dick a confession about how he came by the mine. His story began in 1877. Waltz was up in the mountains, prospecting. Suddenly, he was jumped by 3 renegade Apaches. The Dutchman got away, but only by the skin of his tobacco-stained teeth.
He starts going cross-country. He comes across a sandy wash. And in that wash, there are some footprints, and the footprints are not Indian footprints.
They were boot prints, not Apache moccasins. Desperate for food and water, Waltz tracked the steps.
And he finds a camp, helps himself to the food. That evening, 3 Mexicans come in. The 3 Mexicans are miners. They start talking shop talk. They show him some ore, and at that point, Waltz realizes this is the richest gold ore he's ever seen in his life.
And there was more. Waltz told how the unwary Mexicans showed him their mine. The Dutchman's eyes lit up. He was gaping at a seam of gold ore 18 inches wide.
That gold was that rich, and you could find a vein of it 18 inches wide. In today's market, every 3 feet of that vein would be worth a couple $1 million. Incredibly rich.
Waltz was staring at riches beyond his wildest dreams.
And greed takes over.
He finally had something that he was the only one that knew where it was, and he was going to keep that secret.
Waltz greedily worked the mine the whole winter long. Finally, he was forced back to town to stock up on supplies. But then the Dutchman heard alarming news. Two soldiers showed up in Phoenix spending high-grade ore and telling all of town they'd struck it rich up in the mountains. Waltz dashed back to the Superstitions. Sure enough, he soon spotted one of the soldiers heading straight to what the Dutchman now considered his mine. The Dutchman was tougher than old boots and made quick work of disposing of the two soldiers. But as he told Dick Holmes, the killing was not over yet. Victim number 6 was an innocent prospector who had wandered just too close for Waltz's comfort.
He basically said, I found a prospector in the general area and I killed him just for safekeeping.
The Dutchman buried the body and burnt the unwitting man's possessions. As the old man rambled on, Dick became desperate to steer him towards the only thing he wanted to hear: the location of the mine. But Waltz had one more crime to get off his chest, and it was the most shocking act of them all. With his mine attracting so much attention, Waltz was spending more time protecting his gold than digging it out. He needed a partner he could trust. He wired money to his sister in Germany. Would she send her son over to help? But the uncle and the nephew soon fell out. The old man suspected his new partner was out to kill him. So Waltz drew first. He slung a chain round his neck and dragged the corpse to a sandy spot at Agua Escondido.
And he's lying there and he's saying, Dick, I killed 7 men for this mine and look at me now.
It was this murder of his sister's son that weighed most heavily on the Dutchman's conscience. To try and make amends, he now suggested a deal to Dick. The old killer pointed out a chest at the bottom of the bed. It was where he kept his gold ore. Dick could have the lot if he agreed to something.
And apparently an agreement was struck that if Dick Holmes would take the gold under his bed, he had to send monies to his nephew's mother. And if he would do this, it would relieve his mind and his conscience. And Dick said yes, he would do it.
With the deal sealed, only now did the Dutchman start revealing the directions to the mine.
One of the tragedies of the deathbed confession is that Waltz's priorities were getting things off his conscience first and giving directions last. So by the time he's giving the directions, he's very ill and dying. But when he gets to the directions, they're not as clear as they could be. When he finishes, there's only time for a couple of 3 questions. And Waltz is gone. Waltz supposedly said the mine's in a north-south canyon. Holmes never got to ask the simple question, does the water flow north or does the water flow south? That simple question eliminates 50% of the wrong canyons. Dick never got that chance because Waltz died. And it must have been pretty frustrating.
This confusion about the directions would come back to haunt Dick. But for now, he thought he had what he needed. And he had a chest full of gold ore. When Julia got back, the Dutchman was dead, and Dick and the gold were gone. All hell broke loose between Dick and Julia, and the affair remains a matter of controversy even today.
When he died, he had 48 pounds of this stuff under his bed. Very visible, very rich gold. And while he was dying, Dick Holmes obtained the gold ore.
I'm confident that the Dutchman gave the gold to Dick Holmes as a grubstake to find the mine, with the understanding that when he found it, he would do what was right.
I think he did steal it as he was dying.
When it comes to gold, people will lie.
Some will tell you Dick Holmes was a liar, a robber, and a thief. No, he was not, in my opinion. He was a very honorable man.
No one knows if Dick ever sent money to Germany, but his wife Ida was expecting a baby, and it seems the newlyweds went on a splurge.
The story that Dick Holmes got the gold from under his bed seems to be supported because within 18 months, you check the tax records and Dick Holmes' lifestyle goes like this. You know, new wagon, house, mini ranch, etc.
Gold under the Dutchman's bed sold for $4,800. Gold was $20.67 an ounce. On today's market, it would be worth several $100,000. It was a small fortune. It really was.
Julia was hopping mad and determined to get her revenge. She became hell-bent on getting to the Dutchman's mine and the rest of the gold before Dick. She sold up the business, and word soon got out that she was planning a trip to the mountains.
So you had these two camps, the Dick Holmes camp and the Julia Thomas camp.
But Julia lacked Dick's wilderness savvy. She set out at precisely the wrong time of the year. In high summer, temperatures in the mountains frequently top 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Covering a vast area of over 400 square miles, the Superstitions are mainly parched and barren. Out here, death can come easily to the unprepared. Julia was soon forced to head home, but though down, she was not out. She didn't get the gold, but she found one way to cash in on Waltz. She drew up lost Dutchman mine maps, selling them for $10 a pop. Overnight, a legend was born.
The Dutchman story hits the newspapers and it's nationwide. It goes from San Francisco to St. Louis at a minimum. And people start flooding into Phoenix, and a lot of them come to hunt the lost Dutchman mine.
Soon, all the hucksters in Phoenix were in on Julia's act, supplying any number of phony maps and highly imaginative directions.
It's in a north-south canyon on a small hill.
From the entrance of my mine, you can see the military trail. But from the military trail, you can't see my mine.
From the hill behind his mine, you could just see the tip of Weaver's Needle.
The rays of the setting sun shine into the entrance of my mine.
Julia not only produced bogus maps, she was determined to scupper Dick's chances of getting the gold. She now told everybody that the Dutchman had told Holmes the route to the mine.
So it's no longer a secret.
Holmes now found himself dogged by every gold-hungry greenhorn that had rushed to Phoenix. Dick had to lie low, but at least it seemed none of the Dutchman's genuine directions had leaked out. Waltz said follow the old government trail. Look for a boulder that resembled a man's face. Close by would be a house built of rock. Near to the house would be the entrance to the mine.
Dick thought, well, this is going to be simple.
Months later, Dick thinks the coast is finally clear, but it's obvious from the get-go he's got company. Years before, Dick had tracked the old Dutchman. Now it was his turn to look over his shoulder and shoot the back trail.
Dick's a marked man. He's the only person with the directions, or claims to have the directions, that he was followed every time he went in the mountains.
Afraid of leading rivals straight to the mine, Dick had to turn tail and head back to town. But even when Dick managed to shake off his pursuers, he found many of the Dutchman's directions simply didn't stack up.
He's looking for the old government trail. Simple. He's going to follow that. He'll find the rock that looks like a man.
The problem was that there were at least 3 old government trails. They were used by the army during the Apache Wars. Becoming increasingly desperate, Dick went back to what Waltz told him on his deathbed.
So he starts to check the only things he can check in the story that Waltz gave him. And one of them is that Waltz killed his nephew. He killed him in a specific place, buried him in a specific manner.
The Dutchman said he shot his nephew, dragged him by a chain, and buried him at Agua Escondido, a place Dick knew well.
Dick goes to that place, finds a grave under a shelf, just like Waltz had described, digs, finds the bones of someone, and there's a chain around the neck as if someone had used it to drag a body. So Dick thinks, well, there's got to be a lot to this.
The find at Agua Escondido may have been grisly, but at least it confirmed there was some truth to the deathbed tale. Dick now went back to the hunt with renewed vigor. His target now was the major clue, the rock that looked like a man.
But a rock that looks like a man is a matter of the eye of the beholder.
If you're trying to find a particular rock that looks like, say, a man, it could be an impossibility. And then you might go down a canyon and see 3 of them, but it doesn't mean that that is the particular man.
You go through the superstitions, and there's probably 1,000 places that have a rock that looks like a man.
Dick would also have been disturbed by something else that Jacob Waltz told him from his deathbed. After all the killing, the Dutchman decided to hide the mine from prying eyes. He told Dick he had spent the winter collecting timber and cutting spars to fit over and hide the mine shaft. He then buried the logs under a deep layer of sand and rock.
He said after the first rain, you couldn't tell it was there, and you could drive a mule train over it and not know it. And he made it that solid.
In his darkest moments, Dick may have realized he could have passed over the gold lying a few feet below him. Dick would go on to spend 14 long years on his solitary search. In 1908, he finally teamed up with a partner, his 16-year-old son, George Brownie Holmes. Dick gave Brownie the Dutchman's directions and one crucial piece of advice that could save his life.
He told Brownie, very simply, he says, if you ever find the rock house, make no sign, walk right past it like you haven't found anything, get out of the mountains. You're going to be followed, and don't let anybody ever know that you found something. You can then come back later, more prepared, and go to the mine.
And sure enough, when Dick and Brownie set out on their first journey,
they take one trip into the mountains, but they never get to the mountains because, again, they're being followed, just like Dick had always warned. So they make a detour and they come back.
it was the only trip the two would ever take together.
The second trip never happens. Dick's knee starts to give him trouble. And he's getting a few years on him at this point.
Dick's Dutch hunting days were done. He was no longer able to ride the mountains.
He passes the torch to Brownie.
Brownie eagerly set out to claim the prize that had so eluded his father. But it was now April 1917, and suddenly his hunt came to an abrupt halt. Uncle Sam needed men. Brownie, though hungry for gold, answered the call. And he made it through the Great War, all in one piece. And on his return home, Brownie had one thing on his mind. He signed up as a cowboy at the Quarter Circle U Ranch in the heart of the Superstition Mountains, the ideal base for Dutch hunting. But Brownie soon discovered he was joining a band of cowboys equally obsessed with finding the gold. Brownie had returned from France to a different world, and unlike his father, he wasn't up against a bunch of treasure-hunting rookies. The Quarter Circle U guys were hard-bitten cowhands, and they knew the mountains just as well, if not better, than he did.
I doubt if there's a cowboy that's ridden that range that either doesn't know the story, want to know the story, and after knowing the story, doesn't keep his eyes out.
The ranch hands also had a very different way of working. They wouldn't jealously hoard information, they'd trade it. They would barter any snippet or clue they picked up out on the trail. They hoped by pooling their knowledge, they could land the big prize.
Here's the way the Dutchman thing works. You know a piece of information, I know a piece of information. You get friendly with me, I'm friendly with you. We both hope that the other one will give us more than we give.
The cowboys all knew that Brownie was Dick Holmes's son, and they knew what that meant. Brownie had the Dutchman's directions.
And people asking for help, for a hint, for a direction. But Brownie was pretty close-mouthed.
But Brownie was desperate to find the rock that resembled a man. And with his father's okay, he dropped some big hints round the ranch.
They thought that they would let out just enough of the clues that perhaps someone could find the landmarks that they had not been able to find.
One cowboy took the bait and told Brownie he had seen the rock that looked like a man. He would tell Brownie where, but first he wanted information in exchange.
But they didn't want to tell them enough that they could find the mine without them.
Brownie clammed up and wouldn't trade more clues. If the cowboy had found it, Brownie reasoned, so could he. But legend has it the double-crossed cowboy got his revenge. He crowbarred the rock, sending it crashing down into the ravine. Whether this is just one of the many tall tales surrounding the Dutchman's story is impossible to say. What was clear was that in the 1920s, Brownie was no closer to the mine than his father had been when he first rode out in 1892. The Dutchman had been dead for over 40 years. It seemed to many, the old man's secrets had gone with him to the grave.
The fact is, from about 1900 to 1931, that story almost died.
Then a mysterious and brutal act occurred that would blow the story wide open again. The so-called Adolph Ruth case shocked and fascinated America in equal measure. The Dutchman story was back, and all across the front pages, coast to coast.
In 1931, at the height of the Depression, Adolph Ruth, a man who claimed he was in his 60s but was actually in his 70s, shows up and says he's got a great story and he has the maps and the information that are going to make it really easy to find the mine.
Like countless other Dutch hunters before him, Ruth arrived at the Quarter Circle U Ranch, asking to be guided into the mountains. The cowboys were well used to oddballs, but Ruth stood out. He'd let slip that he had a map, but this one was different. It was Mexican. Ears pricked up. Everyone at the Quarter Circle knew Waltz had stolen the mine, and he'd stolen it from 3 Mexicans. Had Adolph Ruth somehow acquired the one authentic map to the lost mine? Brownie heard the news. He decided it was time for a chat with the old man. Brownie later recalled the two talked long into the night. The conversation was all Dutchman. Whether the map was mentioned is not known, but Brownie did warn the 78-year-old city slicker about tackling the mountains now, high summer. But the old man dismissed Brownie's advice. Ruth was determined to go into the superstitions, and there was no time to waste.
Really, you don't go hunting the Dutchman mine in the summertime. It can cost you your life.
The Quarter Circle U Ranch hands refused to take the stubborn old man. They knew he could die out there. But he ignored them all and managed to find two down-at-heel prospectors who did agree to take him. Ruth packed his map and grabbed his chance.
He gets packed into the mountains. They go to check on him a few days later. He's never seen alive again. His camp's in order, his boots are there. They start looking for him.
The sheriff quickly rounded up a search posse. The men knew Ruth wouldn't last long out in the superstitions.
Now, he went in at the end of May, 1931. Brutal Arizona summers in the Superstition Mountains. His remains aren't found until December.
Music, a black and tan hound, was first to pick up the scent. Brownie was close behind. It was a macabre sight. No skeleton, just a skull, seemingly placed upright.
That skull was laid out very close alongside one of the main trails through the superstitions. Someone may have taken that skull and laid it out there, just as a warning to frighten people to stay out of the mountains.
The skull had two distinct breaches.
There's a small hole on one side of his skull and a large hole on the other.
The inquest concluded that Ruth's skull had been damaged when wolves made off with the corpse. But pretty much everyone else had a different theory. Suspicion fell on the two prospectors who had taken Ruth into the mountains, L.F. Purnell and Jack Keenan. Word was they had shot the old man, then stolen his map, but nothing could ever be proven.
That indiscretion may have caused his death. He shouldn't have advertised the fact that he had what he thought was a secret map. That was a big mistake.
But it wasn't the end of the story. 1 month later, Ruth's skeleton and possessions were found, 3/4 of a mile away from the skull.
And the question has always been, was he murdered for the maps? Because some things were found with him, some things weren't.
The maps were missing, but they did find Ruth's notebook. It contained one page that further deepened the mystery. His final entry, Veni, Vidi, Vici, Latin for I came, I saw, I conquered. And below in English, 200 feet across from the cave. Many believe the cryptic lines proved that Ruth had indeed found the lost Dutchman's mine. The suspicion was that the frail old man had been followed to the mine, murdered, and then dragged away to keep the mine's location secret.
To the true believers, he found the mine and he wrote those words, I came, I saw, I conquered, Caesar's famous statement.
But there is another interpretation of those words.
To those who are perhaps more skeptical, it's a known and documented fact that Adolph Ruth had to move heaven and earth to get to Arizona. His family didn't want him to come, yada, yada. I mean, there was one roadblock after the other put in front of him. When he finally got in the mountains, perhaps he wrote those words to simply say, I beat them all. Everybody tried to stop me, but here I am. I came, I saw, I conquered.
Brownie Holmes was one of those convinced that Ruth hadn't found the mine. It was still out there somewhere. But as with his father 40 years before, intense press coverage now made his search a nightmare.
This story went nationwide. Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. People start coming to the mountains. You gotta remember, this is the height of the Depression. A fabulously rich gold mine just waiting for the finder attracts a lot of attention.
The Superstitions were once again awash with men desperate to get their hands on the long-dead Dutchman's gold. And many chose to keep a close eye on Brownie Holmes.
A lot of people tried to follow Brownie. Some of them simply ruined his trips when he knew he was being followed. He simply gave it up and went back to Phoenix. That happened on several occasions.
Brownie's father, Dick, died in 1933, aged 68. Before passing away, he admitted to Brownie that he could have made a major mistake about one of the clues. The Dutchman had told Dick to start out at the old government military trail. The problem was, there were at least 3 military trails crossing the Superstitions, and Dick later suspected he may have chosen the wrong one. Finally, Dick's long years of failure seemed to have a reason, and now Brownie set out on a new trail. And it wasn't too long before he got a break, and it linked right back to the deathbed confession of Jacob Waltz. Brownie was searching the new trail when he noticed the sand had blown back and revealed some charred rags. Brownie recalled an old tale told by his father. Could the scraps be the clothes of the long-dead prospector? Waltz said he burnt the man's clothes. If these were those clothes, did this mean the mine could be close by? Brownie scoured the area for days, but drew yet one more blank. And out on the new path, Brownie later found old timbers well above the tree line. Could they be the remnants of the logs Waltz had used to hide his mine? Close by, he came across the ruins of an old arastra, a crude device for crushing gold ore. Could it have been used by the Mexican miners Waltz had so brutally murdered? Inconclusive finds maybe, but they gave Brownie confidence that he was finally honing in on the mine. And then one day in 1945, tragedy struck. Brownie's horse suddenly reared and crashed down, crushing his foot. Bugger Red had ended Brownie's active Dutch hunting in an instant. But though Brownie Holmes could no longer ride the high ranges, he still wanted the gold. To realize his lifelong ambition, he needed a trusted partner to go out and search the Superstitions. The obvious choice was his stepson, Billy Harwood. Billy sure dressed the part, but his health was not up to the harsh life in the mountains. Brownie now had no choice. He had to hand over the long-held Holmes family secrets to an outsider.
Remember, Brownie had been approached by people and hounded by people about the mine for decades. But he met one man in whom Brownie trusted. He became Brownie's adopted son of the mountains, actually.
Clayton Wurst, first heard of the Dutchman when he was 6 and had grown up on the legend.
Brownie passed the torch, which had been passed to him from his father, to this gentleman.
And Brownie, when he first took me into his confidence, he said, "Clay, nobody must know that you and I are working together." He said, "There are times that I felt my own life was jeopardized, being back in the mountains with the knowledge I possessed." And he said, "Clay, there are people back there that would do you harm."
And Brownie's words of warning soon rang true.
I turned around and the guy had a Krag rifle with a striker back and a safety off right in the middle of my stomach. And I was one scared boy. I had a sidearm, but shoot, he had me. If I'd have reached for a gun, he'd have killed me.
Cool-headed Clay managed to talk the stranger out of murder and lived to report back to his now ranch-bound mentor. George Brownie Holmes died in 1980. He'd spent 72 of his 88 years hunting the lost Dutchman's mine.
Was Brownie a disappointed man? Well, in some sense, I suppose he was. And yet, I don't think he would have traded those years that he spent hunting the Dutchman for any other field of endeavor.
Sadly, Clay never got the chance to tell his old friend Brownie about an astonishing breakthrough he has made. Clay claims he's finally found the elusive clue that both Dick and Brownie spent their whole lives searching for.
Oh, the rock that looked like a man, yes, it absolutely exists. It's absolutely there. It not only exists, it's where it is supposed to be.
Clay won't confirm if he has found one of the other known clues, the house built in the rock. However, he says he has located 2 final clues that have never been made public.
The last 2 have been found.
These clues have remained a secret ever since the dying Dutchman revealed them to Dick Holmes. Dick then gave them to Brownie. Brownie later passed the clues to Clay, who was sworn to secrecy.
This is what I don't want to go into, is the clues to the mine's location.
With every clue finally nailed, Clay thinks he's close to solving the puzzle of the lost Dutchman's mine.
We haven't found the mine, but at least we've found a place in which to search.
Small area or not, the Dutchman hid his mine well. Clay now plans to use 21st century metal detection technology to pinpoint the 18-inch wide gold seam, last seen in the 1880s. But even if Clay finally announces he's found the long-lost mine, many will dismiss his discovery out of hand. They've heard it all before.
Well, it's probably the most found lost mine in the world.
If somebody was out there in the Superstitions and found what was called the Lost Dutchman Mine, and they had neon lights blinking, this was the Lost Dutchman Mine, and the gold was still dripping from the walls, it wouldn't stop anybody from looking from the mine, because that can't be the Lost Dutchman.
But you know what? No matter what you say, no matter what I say, no matter what somebody else says, they are going to hunt for the Dutchman forever. It's a legend, and that's what a legend's all about.
In the late 1800s, a young man called Dick Holmes heard a story that made him take off to the mountains to seek out his fortune. And with each passing generation, people come to Arizona and follow in the footsteps of Dick Holmes, searching for the lost Dutchman's mine, chasing one of the greatest tales of the old Wild West. The Garden of Eden, the biblical birthplace of all humanity.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it.
But is it just a story? Or did Eden really exist?
Every culture has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened.
One maverick scientist was desperate to know the truth.
Why did they tell that story? Where did it come from? And what's behind it?
He risked everything to find the answer.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now.
This is the story of one man's quest for the Garden of Eden.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right.
In 1987, a respected magazine published an article about the work of a little-known archaeologist named Juris Zarins. In it, Zarins claimed to know the earthly location of paradise, the Garden of Eden. Zarins' work caused a storm. Many religious people felt it was sacrilege to apply scientific principles to the Word of God. It should be accepted on faith or not at all.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now. It's like anything else. I don't believe that, I don't want to know that, that's different, that's uncomfortable.
Some respected academics were also deeply skeptical. They thought Zarins was just wasting his time. Many biblical scholars thought the story was just an allegory, with no basis in fact.
Certainly by the 19th century, most educated people no longer think the story of the Garden of Eden is a literal account of the beginning of humanity and the fall of mankind.
But Zarins did not care about other people's opinions.
Most people are not interested in trying to think through. Let's put it this way. If I said to you, I'm going to research the Garden of Eden based upon the Genesis story, people are going to go, well, why?
Surprisingly, this was not a religious quest, nor was it a hunt for buried treasure or precious relics. It was a journey motivated purely by a thirst for knowledge. Zarins wanted to know about the origins of human society. And despite the fact he is a committed atheist, he thought that the answers lay in, of all places, a biblical legend.
A faith person will say, yeah, that happened, and I believe it, that's the end of it, okay? But a scientific person says, well, why did they tell that story? Where did it come from, and what's behind it? And then you start, like a detective, you start looking at it.
Zarins' archaeological career had a promising start. But despite his keen intellect, many people found working with him a challenge.
He's nuts. If someone has spoken with Yuri, they understand. He's brilliant. The man is brilliant beyond words. But he is a little bit hard to follow. Intellectually, yes, he is truly one of the most intelligent human beings I've ever met. Socially, he's 5. But
perhaps because of his unorthodox style, finding an environment he could work in wasn't easy. But he secured a place at a small college in the heart of the American Midwest called Missouri State University.
I had to find a job, and you just don't get a job at just any old place. Particularly archaeology. Archaeological jobs are hard to come by in academic circles, so you take one where you can get it.
But rather than hinder his career, Zarins found his work at Missouri State helped him become something of a rising star.
this guy did things that news media covers. I mean, he made Smithsonian, Nat Geo, worked on projects that were, had huge budgets. So he brought press and money through the school, which is always good for the school. He was very much encouraged to do his own thing.
The freedom Zarins had at Missouri State meant he could pick and choose his own passions to follow. So he spent most of his time indulging his greatest passion: the vast deserts of Arabia.
The reason I love it is because it's so austere. It makes you come to grips with yourself. You have to learn about yourself. You have to learn about others and trust others, but you have to learn how to survive and how to suffer. I like that.
Arabia was also rich terrain for an up-and-coming archaeologist making a name for himself. Unlike the well-trodden sites of the ancient classical world of the Mediterranean or Egypt, Arabia was undiscovered country.
Arabia was a cultural landscape. It was like a desert, literally, because archaeologists hadn't been allowed in. The tribes were too dangerous in most places in Arabia. It's so remote. Many places are so remote. Believe it or not, I'm the first person sometimes to touch something that's 500,000 years old.
Zarins also developed a reputation as something of a maverick. He refused to follow the traditional academic career path and started taking, in effect, freelance commissions. He would work with pretty much anyone who had an idea he liked the sound of.
Works the same no matter who's paying for it, isn't it? Who cares?
These non-conformist methods led him to a project in Oman related to, of all things, a Bible story. The legend of the 3 kings bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Our real project was to find out and figure out the frankincense trade.
Zarins and his team set off into the vast Arabian desert. They wanted to know how long people had been trading frankincense and how it came to be such a valuable commodity across the ancient world.
Frankincense only grows a couple places in the world, and it originates in that Oman, Yemen region. We went on to study basically the trade routes, where it would have come from, how they would have transported it, what they were doing with it.
Zarins, Owen, and their colleagues worked in Oman's so-called empty quarter for more than 4 years, looking for evidence of trade routes stretching as far as India, Egypt, and Rome. And after an extensive search, they made an extraordinary discovery, a lost city called Ubar. Legends of Ubar can be found in the book of 1001 Arabian Nights, where it is described as a place of fantastic wealth and lush greenery in the desert. According to the Quran, it was supposedly destroyed by God as a punishment for its misbehaving king. Indeed, until Zarins found it, no one was even sure if Ubar really existed.
So we found this location, this oasis in the center of southern Oman, and we found out that this was the jumping off place where they were congregating and sending caravans. Hundreds of animals were being transported in this direction, and they were using frankincense, among other things, to trade.
And those trade caravans we know moved for centuries.
Zarins discovered that frankincense had been traded across the region for at least 8,000 years. From Ubar, frankincense caravans would have set off in all directions, including, of course, to the Holy Land. Along with goods to sell, these caravans would have carried something else, stories, including many that eventually found their way into the Bible. Zarins realized its authors borrowed some of their material from other cultures.
It's called plagiarism. They plagiarized it, stole it, and repackaged it. The Hebrew Bible repackaged a story that's much older and came from its proper location where people lived and experienced it.
Zarins began to wonder about the origins of one story in particular, the tale of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He wondered whether it was one of the stories that had been borrowed from another culture. Of all the many fables in the Bible, this one seemed to be based on real events.
When people wrote something down, they're not lying to you. It's not baloney. It's just that they don't think you need scientific evidence.
Zarins was convinced that the ancient Hebrew people who wrote the Bible could not have possibly created this legend on their own. So where did it come from originally? Zarins decided to find out. His quest for the Garden of Eden had begun. His first clue came from the very word, Eden. How this word came to be in the Bible has always been something of a mystery, because it is not native to Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament.
Eden doesn't translate literally with a Hebrew translation or any kind of Semitic translation. It's not a word that's particular to the language of the story that we're familiar with. They knew the story from somewhere else because they incorporated some of that language.
Where did the ancient Hebrews first hear this word? Zarins knew it came from an area about 800 miles to the east of the Holy Land, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. He also knew it dated back to the world's oldest known civilization, the first people to create an organized urban society, the Sumerians.
The Sumerians would be the earliest groups of people who settled and began to cultivate the land in the area of the Tigris-Euphrates. Sumer is the first really organized group of agricultural city-states, and they began to develop a network of interaction through their crops and their trade and using the rivers.
It was these ancient people who first used the word Eden.
It's a very, very ancient word, which the Sumerians used in a very ancient way, and it means a land of steppes or grasslands where people live kind of wild, where animals are wild.
The Sumerians used the term Eden to refer to uncultivated areas beyond their territory. In other words, the sort of place where nature was not controlled by man, but by God. If this word, Eden, came from Mesopotamia, then it seemed logical that the Garden of Eden was located there. This idea was supported by the fact that many early Bible stories have Mesopotamian roots.
If you look at the history of the biblical people, if you look at an Abraham, a biblical Abraham, he came from somewhere in that region.
For example, most people don't know that Sumer's mentioned in Genesis is called Shinar. The Tower of Babel, these are all Sumerian stories.
In fact, the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, up to the point where Abraham departs for Egypt, takes place in Mesopotamia.
Everything in those stories is from Mesopotamia. If you don't believe me, read it.
In the 1980s, Zarins' curiosity piqued, and he formally took up the quest that he had been informally pursuing for years. He started a study group to test out the idea that the Garden of Eden was a real place and discover where that place was. If he couldn't convince his own students his ideas were right, he wouldn't be able to convince anyone.
We met in his office, because there were like 5 of us. We talked about some of these things. It made a lot of sense to him, and it didn't take him long to talk us into seeing the logic of it. And at that point, he was still our professor. He wasn't somebody I'd spent 20 years working with. He was my professor. So clearly he knew something.
Zarins' starting point was the Bible itself, and its first, oldest part, the book of Genesis.
Well, I should perhaps explain that the Bible has 2 accounts of creation. The Garden of Eden story is the second one, and probably the earlier one.
The story begins when God plants a garden eastward in Eden. There, he made every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And of course, in the middle of the garden, he put the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it, or as the Israelites knew it. And there was a kind of a test in the garden. There are these 2 trees, the tree of life, which the first humans are not barred from eating from, which gives immortality, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which gives some kind of wisdom.
As every Sunday school student knows, one day, a serpent tempts Eve into eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge.
So she eats of the tree of knowledge and gives some to her husband, Adam, who meekly follows.
As punishment, God casts Adam and Eve out of the garden. and later destroyed Eden along with the rest of the earth in the great biblical flood. And yet, ever since that day, people have sought to find Eden, or at least evidence that it truly existed. The very text of the Bible actually provides some tantalizing clues about Eden's possible location.
Genesis 2-3, the famous story, has some verses in verses 10 to 14 where a river is said to come out of the Garden of Eden, and it becomes 4 headwaters. And the rivers in question are Tigris and Euphrates, and we all know where they are. They're the major rivers of Mesopotamia and the modern Iraq.
The other 2 rivers are called the Pishon and the Gihon. Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, which still flow today, no one knew where these other 2 rivers once ran, or if they ever really existed. It appears these 2 rivers have always been quite obscure, even in biblical times. In fact, the first known mention of them is the Bible itself.
Quite a bit more is said about those 2 rivers in the text, which probably implies that to the ancient Hebrews too, though those rivers were a bit more unknown and mysterious, so required a bit of elaboration.
The Pishon is said to encompass a mineral-rich land called Havilah, and the Gihon is said to flow through a land called Cush. Some versions of the Bible translate Cush as Ethiopia. Locating these 2 rivers and where they joined with the Tigris and Euphrates to form the famous 4 headwaters was the key to unlocking the mystery of Eden's position. Find the rivers, and Zarins would find Eden.
What happens is it just says there were 4 rivers, and they made 1 river, and that's where the garden is. I mean, if everybody knew where the 4 rivers was, the biblical scholars would have solved this question years ago.
The location of the Pishon and the Gihon has baffled scholars for centuries. Many medieval thinkers thought the Pishon might be the river Ganges, India's holiest river. As for the Gihon, even today, most biblical scholars believe that it refers to the River Nile.
Now, the text says, the River Gihon flows around the whole land of Cush. And Cush, everywhere else in the Old Testament, means Nubia or the Sudan. And Jewish tradition was very strongly convinced of that over many centuries. It didn't deviate. And the fact that it goes all the way around the land of Cush, which is the name for Sudan, south of Egypt, the Nile is the only important river there.
But that interpretation presented a serious problem. The Nile isn't anywhere near the Tigris or the Euphrates. So there is no place on Earth where it could join with them and the Pishon to form the all-important 4 headwaters, the location of the Garden of Eden.
The ancient Israelites' knowledge of distant geography wasn't perfect. Their geography is a bit confused because we know the Nile doesn't really join up anywhere near the Tigris-Euphrates.
If the authors of the Bible made such fundamental errors like connecting the Nile to the Euphrates, how could they be trusted about anything else? The Garden of Eden could be literally anywhere. For hundreds of years, scholars have faced this exact problem, and some of them found a very inventive solution. They put the Garden of Eden wherever they wanted.
Well, a president of Boston University, no less, in the 19th century called William Warren, who located the Garden of Eden at the North Pole. Mormons locate the Garden of Eden in Jackson County, Missouri, in the United States. Columbus thought he'd found it by the Orinoco River in Venezuela. There were some who wanted to locate it in China. Well, if you think the Garden was in the East, well, put it in the Far East.
But for Zarins, the Bible's incoherent geography left him at a dead end. If he tried to follow its directions to Eden, he would be lost wandering in the wilderness forever. It was the same fate that had befallen every Eden seeker of the past. But Zarins found a way around the impasse. His solution was to abandon his Bible studies and turn instead to a more traditional academic discipline: history. Zarins knew that the word Eden had come from the world's first civilization, the Sumerians. Sumer also happens to be the one place where two of the four biblical rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, touch. This offered Zarins and his group another avenue to explore. The Sumerians were the world's first people to use writing, and by recording their thoughts for posterity, they quite literally invented history.
They created writing in order to make sure who got what came from who did it, who paid taxes and who didn't. So somebody didn't say, I paid, I didn't pay, oh, I can't remember, did I pay, did I not pay? Now they're writing it down and go, no, it says here you didn't, right?
Although writing was invented as a means of bookkeeping, the Sumerians quickly found it was a useful tool for recording other ideas.
Later on, they got around to writing down things like people were sitting around thinking great thoughts and wrote down their stories. Yeah.
One of those stories was of particular importance to the Eden Project, a tale that quite possibly is the world's oldest written story.
Every culture, be it a literate culture or a non-literate culture, has a creation story, has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened. And if you look at that root story, the oldest written version of a creation story comes to us from the Sumerians.
The story the Sumerians wrote is known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it has some shocking similarities to the story of Eden, similarities which would help guide Zarins on his quest.
Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk in Mesopotamia who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. And that was his problem. Because he was only 2/3 god, he was not immortal, but destined to die like those of us who are 3/3 human. He became overwhelmed with a sense of his own human mortality, so he wanted to find the secret of immortality.
In his search for the secret of immortality, Gilgamesh meets various characters who explain to him how humans came to be.
The Sumerians talk about man being created from clay, which makes sense. They're a river culture, so what is the substance that's most useful and most abundant? It's clay.
Men were created out of clay. Okay, and as they were created out of clay, then they said, well, now wait a minute, we got to get women in here somehow, so then we get women made out of men, and then we put them in a place where people live forever, where it was really nice, and nobody got sick, people lived at the bequest of God. You know, that's that kind of story.
When compared to the story of Eden, this earlier creation story has a distinctly familiar ring. Adam, too, was created out of clay, and Eve was created out of Adam's body. And the Sumerian idea of a land where there is no unhappiness, illness, or death has an obvious parallel to the Garden of Eden itself. The one difference is that the Sumerians did not call their version of paradise Eden. They called it Dilmun.
Dilmun refers to a place. It's a specific place. It's a settled paradise. It's an abundance. All blessings of nature sort of come together. It's a way to live without worry.
The similarities are uncanny, even down to the way both Dilmun and Eden are eventually destroyed in a great flood.
So man is created from clay to serve the gods. In serving the gods, man becomes annoying to the gods. And the gods say, oh, we need to make this go away. And they make it rain. So there's a flood story. Someone is saved, and they go on to then repopulate the earth.
In the Sumerian version of the story, the man who was saved and repopulates the earth is not called Noah. His name is Utnapishtim. And in return for saving humanity, one remorseful God grants him the gift of eternal life.
Gilgamesh is looking at this and saying, well, how do I get eternal life? So he's going to go searching for it.
Gilgamesh, the Sumerian god king, seeks out Utnapishtim, hoping the old man will reveal the secret of living forever. When they meet, Utnapishtim realizes that Gilgamesh is a hero, worthy of immortality, and tells him how to achieve it.
Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the secret of immortality is for him to find the plant of life and to eat from this.
He also tells Gilgamesh that the plant will be underwater, in the place where paradise once stood, the land of Dilmun.
This is a clue to scholars to say, well, where is he searching for this? And the answer is the land of Dilmun, which is the land of paradise.
After an epic journey, Gilgamesh reaches Dilmun. But just when he has immortality within his grasp, disaster strikes.
He finds this plant of life in the water, and he's just going to grasp it and consume it. But unfortunately for him, a serpent snatches it away first, and the serpent rejuvenates itself.
This tale of humankind being offered the chance of eternal life, only to have it snatched away, is of course exactly the same fate that befalls Adam and Eve.
There is a moral in this story that immortality is something just beyond humans' grasp. And there is a similar theme in the Garden of Eden story, that the human beings were originally not debarred from eating of the tree of life, but because they disobeyed God and ate of the tree of knowledge, they are cast out of the garden and lose the chance of eating of the tree of life, so in a sense are doomed from the chance of having an immortal existence in this life.
As far as Zarins was concerned, it was clear that the story of Eden was nothing more than a Hebrew interpretation of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I would say it was the same thing, because Adam transgresses and Eve, and so they're punished by having mortality, and they have to work for a living.
When ancient Hebrews heard these Sumerian stories, Zarins believes they decided to make them their own and put them in the Bible.
The biblical story changed the Mesopotamian story, if you like. It monotheized it, so it's not simply taking over a pagan story. It's now only one God who brings the flood and delivers the flood hero. There's a proper reason for the flood. It's because of humans' sin.
Unfortunately, the story itself did not seem to offer any obvious clues to Eden's location. It seemed like yet another dead end. But there was one thing that offered Zarins a glimmer of hope. The name the Sumerians used for their version of paradise, Dilmun. If he couldn't find Eden, perhaps he could find Dilmun. Zarins was not the first person to make the connection between Eden and Dilmun. Ever since the Sumerian language was first decrypted, scholars have suggested that the two places might somehow be linked.
Dilmun is interesting because it's debated. It's supposed to be this idealized paradise, this special place that's very advanced, where civilization and culture thrive. It would be like in Atlantis. We have this mystery place where these incredible advances happen.
As far as anyone knew, Dilmun was just a myth, a parable that had no basis in fact. If that were true, then Eden too was never likely to have been a real place. Zarins, however, knew that Dilmun was not simply a figment of the imagination. It was a real place. In fact, he was one of the people who discovered it in the 1970s. Now, in the quest for Eden, Zarins found himself revisiting his earlier work.
Yuri was in the field, going to all these places looking for evidence of early civilization, stone tools. So he was looking for these things, and I don't know if it sparked in his mind then or it sparked later as he came back and processed more and more of what he'd seen. But it came together by the time I had begun to study with him as a cohesive idea.
Zarins and his colleagues found evidence of a civilization, a string of trading centers that once thrived along the eastern shores of Arabia. Today, evidence of this culture can still be seen on the Arabian island of Bahrain.
When we began to work in Saudi Arabia, we helped discover that, and it's a very, very rich region.
This discovery came as something of a surprise, considering that today, the area is little more than a vast, empty desert.
It was a place where different people congregated. It was the ancient Hong Kong. People had good stuff coming in from everywhere.
Crucially, Zarins discovered that Sumerian traders had visited this land and recorded the name of it as Dilmun.
The Sumerian cities became actively interested in trade. with any place that they could possibly trade with. So they're looking for raw materials. They bring raw materials back to Sumer, make nice things, sell them back to them at a profit. So they were in the Gulf. As soon as the Sumerians start writing, they write bingo, Dilmun. So we know that.
But why would the Sumerians think of this run-of-the-mill trading center as a paradise? The answer may lie with the distance between Dilmun and Sumer. It could only be reached by sea, and even then, only the most intrepid sailors ever went there. Just like sailors throughout history, they brought home tall tales of this faraway land.
You know how sailors are. They love places that are far away. Sailors don't talk about home. They talk about distant places so they can impress people where they've been. They found this place in the Gulf with this beautiful water, and they start talking about it.
The Sumerian sailors told of a place that was not only rich and magnificent, but lush. Unlike the dry, hard scrabble land of Sumer, Dilmun was verdant and green.
It's exotic to the Sumerians, but not exotic to local people. So, you know, they just make a transference of what it was, how beautiful it was.
Over time, Sumerians came to think of Dilmun as a special place. So much so, they assumed it was the very place where humankind was first created. Zarins had started with a cryptic biblical legend. History in the form of the world's oldest story allowed him to link Eden to the Sumerian paradise of Dilmun. Archaeology had helped him discover that Dilmun was a real place. Yet still, the Dilmun that Zarins discovered was nothing more than a desert trading outpost. There seemed nothing to support the idea of it being green and beautiful. Another roadblock on the way to the Garden of Eden. To get past it, Zarins gave up on the idea of scouring the historical record and turned instead to hard science.
His undergraduate work was in geology, so he has a background in hard science as well, which is, again, what makes him interesting. Because of all of Yuri's different talents, he brings it all together and then is, like I said, a much better storyteller because he can actually look at something both scientifically and as an anthropologist or archaeologist would.
The quest for Eden turned to the physical landscape of eastern Arabia and to the thorny question of the two missing rivers, the Gihon and the Pishon. If Zarins could not find them, then his whole quest would come to nothing.
We know the Tigris and Euphrates clearly are in Iraq at this point in time. And the question was, where would you get two other rivers that connect up with that? And that's where the science comes in.
There was no obvious way to break this impasse. Then, an answer came from the heavens. About the time that Zarins was in the thick of his quest, a revolutionary new technology came online. Satellite imagery. NASA had recently launched Landsat, a satellite designed to photograph the planet in its entirety for the first time. Today, this kind of imagery is commonplace, but in the 1980s, it was revolutionary.
You have to remember that in the late 80s, remote sensing was just beginning, and as a result of that, we're getting our first pictures, our first Landsat images were just beginning to pop up.
But simply getting hold of these images would be a challenging quest in itself. This was cutting-edge technology. A professor at an obscure Midwestern college chasing a legend was very much at the back of the queue.
Satellite images are really difficult to get a hold of because first they weren't that readily available. You have to beg people to produce this map for me.
Luckily, Zarins had a friend at NASA who snuck him some early low-resolution pictures. At last, Zarins was closing in on his goal. For the first time, he and his students could see the land of Dilmun in a way that had literally never been seen before.
It certainly changed things. If you're looking at an overview, if you're looking down on something like you would do with a Landsat photo, it's much more clear than if you're standing on the ground. So yes, it made a tremendous difference.
A careful study of the images revealed a shocking revelation. A river, or more specifically, a dry channel snaking through eastern Saudi Arabia. It clearly marked where a river would once have flowed.
When you put the satellite image, you can just generally see it. You can like, this is it. And then you start drawing where the other rivers are. It really makes sense.
It was the breakthrough that Zarins had been seeking since his journey began. Now, as well as the Tigris and the Euphrates, he had found a third river, the Pishon.
The river originates in northwest Saudi Arabia. It's called the Arima, and it has multiple branches, and it comes down, comes around a little bit, then it starts swinging north, and now the Arabs call it the Wadi Button, belly button river. And it comes around, and it makes a huge delta by Kuwait. This would be the Pishon.
From the ground, this dry river channel, the Pishon, is all but impossible to see. It would appear as nothing more than a slight depression in the sand.
You would have no idea. You'd just be like, oh, more desert. You know, you couldn't picture it as lush and fertile.
But using detailed images obtained from Landsat's camera, this former river stood out clearly.
And then you look down and you're like, wait a minute, that's, oh. And that, at one time, this was all water.
When it was in full flow, the people of Dilmun would have had a perpetual water source, and there would have been plenty of food along the banks. It would have been a place of abundant life.
When you realize that a dried up riverbed, it was actually once a water source, that changes the whole lay of the land. And that's a eureka moment.
However, there was a problem. The river Zarins discovered clearly provided a source of water to the Sumerian version of Eden, Dilmun. But something was missing. The place where it connected to the Tigris and the Euphrates showed no evidence of ever being the beautiful, lush garden described in the Bible's story. And also, where was the fourth river, the Gihon? It looked like yet another dead end, but having come so far, Zarins wasn't about to give up. Reviewing all his evidence, Zarins had a revelation. He was looking for a place that existed thousands of years ago. So perhaps he should not simply look for where the biblical rivers flowed, but when. He quickly realized that the last time the Pishon had any water in it was 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
It was an Ice Age river. All of Arabia was drained by 3 huge rivers in the Ice Age. And gradually, in what we call the Neolithic period, they dried up and they weren't as extensive. So when they connected up, obviously the landscape was different. And so now you have to figure out when that was. The answer is about 5,000–6,000 BC.
This element of timing is important for 2 reasons. First, back when this river was still flowing, the region of the Persian Gulf looked quite different to how it does today. In fact, at that time, there was no Persian Gulf. It was dry land.
The Gulf is, during the last ice age, was completely dry land because sea level fell about 200 feet, and the deepest part of the Gulf is 120 feet. You'll figure it out. It's all dry.
If there was no water in the Persian Gulf, then the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Pishon must have continued flowing for many more miles beyond where they meet the sea today. They would have combined to form one great river, just as described in the Bible.
The rivers connect up ahead of what is today just south or near Basra. That's where they would connect up. And now you can't see it because the Gulf's higher than what it is now.
But there was another, more important factor. 8,000 years ago, the climate of the region was totally different. At that time, monsoon rains, which today only reach the southernmost tip of Arabia, would have covered the whole peninsula with life-giving rain. It was this rain that fed the Pishon, allowing it to flow all year round. More importantly, the land around the river would not have been a harsh desert. It would have been lush and green. This is why the Sumerians thought of Dilmun as the birthplace of humanity, because it was a paradise.
The land of Eden. It would have been a steppe land with lots of little oases, marshlands, just like southern Iraq was to many people for a long time after that. It's a beautiful area. You got water, you got resources, you got mud, you can build houses, you got reeds, animals, plants, you got it all.
But although it would have undoubtedly been Eden-like, was this actually the Eden? Without the fourth river, the Gihon, it couldn't be. The Bible describes the Gihon as flowing through the land of Cush. For centuries, most scholars believed Cush referred to an area in East Africa. In fact, the King James Version of the Bible even uses the word Ethiopia. But Zarins knew there was a different interpretation. Cush could also be a reference to the area around the Zagros Mountains, located in modern-day Iran.
Then they said, oh, the Gihon, it comes out of the land of Cush. And they go, well, now, he was explaining to you that Cush is another word for Iran. See? You have to know that.
As it happens, there is a major river that still flows out of the Zagros Mountains, the land of Cush. Today, it is called the Karun.
The Karun River, which comes out of Iran, is still there, still carries water, comes out of the Zagros.
Until it was dammed in the 1970s, it too connected with the Tigris and the Euphrates, at the exact place where the newly discovered Pishon also joins. These rivers form the so-called four headwaters that flowed southward to form one great river. Zarins believed this was the location of the Garden of Eden. This last discovery was the final proof Zarins needed for his theory. Several times he was close to failure. It was only by combining his knowledge across so many disciplines that he was able to finally solve this ancient puzzle.
That's something that's a little bit unique to Yuri, in that his background is diverse enough that he can put it together in a bigger picture, which is that creative aspect of being multidisciplinary. Because of all of Yuri's different talents, you know, he brings it all together, and he's just a much better storyteller.
But like the maverick he is, Juris Zarins refuses to take all the credit. He believes his breakthrough only came thanks to the work of others, across many different disciplines. All he did was put these pieces of the puzzle together.
You think that's where it is, and you draw satisfaction from saying that you pushed the ball forward a little bit because you added a lot more data and made people think about it, not just from reading the text.
This was not the end of the quest. Zarins refused to rest on his laurels. For him, the location of the garden was not the most important thing. He wanted to know how true the story in the Bible was, and what it really meant. Putting together everything he had learned so far, it occurred to Zarins that the story was not really about how the first human beings were created. Instead, it was about how human society was created. The epoch-defining moment when we humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and started becoming farmers.
The Garden of Eden story is an explanation of how farming originated.
Zarins' theory rests on a radical notion, the idea that the Garden of Eden was not the only one of its kind. He believes that the whole region, the land known as Dilmun, was filled with Eden-like places.
Well, the garden no different than any oasis you see now in Arabia. Arabia, it's called an oasis because subterranean water fractures and everything turns green. Attracts plants, attracts humans, attracts animals. It's just a place where people congregate. So this was a kind of a marshy, green area that attracted animals, plants, and so on, and original people.
According to Zarins, the Garden of Eden was a home to prehistoric humans, hunter-gatherers who were able to survive purely from what they found growing naturally. But as the last ice age ended, the waters in the world's oceans began to rise. Eventually, this garden of paradise would have been drowned in the flood. In its place today, we find the Persian Gulf.
It flooded the area, and it flooded the Garden of Eden. It's flooded. It's underwater now. Can't see it.
The floods forced humans to move northwards into the much harsher landscape of Mesopotamia that we are familiar with today. There was no easy living here. If people wanted food, they had to grow it. They had to become farmers. And that meant using primitive technology to cultivate the land.
When people create inventions of some kind or another, whether it's taming nature or inventing metals or writing, you can never go back. You just can't reverse technological progress. And so it began with this idea of agriculture being one of the first ideas of change.
Zarins believes that the story of Eden was written as a lament for this extraordinary change and a yearning for the days of a simpler life. The advent of agriculture was not described as a great leap forward, but as a sin. Eve eating from the tree of knowledge.
What happened was they fell. They fell from grace. What is that? What does that mean? That means they transgressed against what God had provided. They knew better, and that's what we call the origin of agriculture. You know how to manipulate things now. You know how to make plants grow. You know how to create animals and get natural selection.
In 1987, the results of Zarins' work were published in Smithsonian Magazine.
Very satisfying to have that feeling that there's an answer, there's an explanation that is based in science as well as literature, that you can put these two things together and tell a story that is very identifiable. It's, oh, this is not so far off the mark. This works. This makes more sense than just poof, magic.
But once he put his ideas in the public sphere, Zarins discovered that many academics gave them short shrift.
Juris Zarins' views, I think, have multiple problems attached to them. The first is that the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flow down from the mountains of Armenia into the Persian Gulf area. Genesis 2 says the rivers flow out of Eden and become 4 headwaters. So that implies they are going from a higher area down to the Persian Gulf area. And so I think he's located the Garden of Eden at the wrong end. Even the ancient Hebrews knew that rivers don't flow upwards.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right. You know, academics being what they are, they wish they wrote it. They don't pay any attention to any of that.
But perhaps surprisingly, these theories were not so quickly rejected by people with a more religious disposition. In fact, many welcomed his work.
I would have expected, particularly here in the Bible Belt, Springfield is in the Bible Belt, I would have expected backlash. Juris spoke to more church groups, was invited to more public venues where you would have thought they would have been hostile to his ideas. And yet again, he's such a good storyteller. It's not offensive. He's in no way saying what you think is stupid. He's saying, here's a way to look at it scientifically and let your story be real. And he was welcomed in many cases with open arms. It was kind of fun to watch. I expected there to be more of a uproar.
The extraordinary insight of Juris Zarins showed that the legend of the Garden of Eden might be more than just a parable. It might be a true story, a story of how human society came to be. sailors' stories told of a Spanish treasure galleon wrecked off Florida 300 years ago.
The richest Spanish galleon that ever crossed the pond from Spain.
The legendary wealth of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha fed the fantasies of treasure hunters.
There's so much treasure on the Atocha, it's incredible.
Generations of adventurers schemed and dreamed of discovering her riches.
A lot of people thought that Dad was off his rocker. You know, they thought, this guy is living in a dream world.
But Mel Fisher set out to find the wreck.
It's fun, romance, and adventure.
Sunken treasure was his obsession.
It gets in your blood and you just can't stop.
He set his heart on discovering the millions in gold, silver, and emeralds.
Dad told us every day, today's the day you're going to find the treasure.
Look at that baby.
This is the true story of Mel Fisher's extraordinary hunt for the treasure of the lost Spanish galleon. Even as a boy growing up in Indiana during the 1930s, Mel Fisher was obsessed with tales of treasure, especially sunken treasure. Unfortunately, the complex and expensive equipment needed to dive old shipwrecks put treasure hunting out of reach for ordinary people. But young Mel Fisher was no ordinary person.
When Dad was 12, he made his own dive hood. It was a 5-gallon bucket, and he put a piece of glass in it. And then he had a hose going up to the surface, and his friend had a bicycle pump. But air stopped coming, and he almost drowned in that lake.
But for all his dreams of treasure, by the early 1950s, Mel Fisher was scratching out a living as a chicken farmer, when technology changed his life. Mel learned of a diving revolution, the invention of the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, scuba. Wearing a scuba air tank, Mel was able to live out his childhood fantasies. At last, he could dive for treasure. Mel sold the chicken farm, and in 1953, with his wife Dio, opened the first dive shop and dive school in California, at Redondo Beach. He organized treasure hunting expeditions on wrecks made famous by pirate legend and old tales of sunken treasure.
He was like the Pied Piper. Everyone wanted to go with him. Everyone wanted to be a part of it. And he made everything exciting.
Mel found no shortage of clients eager to taste the thrill of treasure hunting. It easily becomes an obsession.
I found my first treasure when I was 9 years old. And it's a very addictive feeling.
There's a definite thrill there, a personal feeling that you get when you see something that nobody else has seen or touched for a few hundred years and bring it to the surface.
You just get tingles all over, and you just want to find more.
Even with a growing family, enthusiastic amateur treasure hunter Mel Fisher took every opportunity to indulge his passion.
He would save up every year and go treasure hunting for vacation. And then his vacation kept getting longer and longer.
Mel's problem was that he lived on the West Coast in California. But the best area for treasure hunting was on the East Coast in Florida and the Caribbean. There are more sunken treasure ships there than anywhere else in the world.
My father told me that he thought there was a shipwreck about every 100 yards from Havana, Cuba to North Carolina. Of course, they're not all filled with gold doubloons, and that's the ones that he was after.
The reason the East Coast is so rich in wrecks is down to the forces of geography and weather. From the 15th century on, the Spanish ruled and plundered the riches of Central and South America. large fleets of Spanish galleons, each loaded with tons of gold, silver, and jewels, sailed from Cuba for Spain every year for centuries.
It was a tremendous flow of wealth for 300 years, and all of the richest families had people over there sending it home.
Most of the ships made it home most of the time, but the shallow waters inside the reef of the Florida Keys became a death trap in the hurricane season.
These hurricanes would push them into that reef and then over it inside the reef, and that's where they would end up breaking up and sinking.
Over the centuries, valuable treasures have been salvaged from rich ships found on the seabed. Occasionally, the sea would give up a clue to the location of a fortune. In the early 1960s, gold fever struck in Florida. Suddenly, gold doubloons and silver pieces of 8 began appearing on beaches.
They had been finding coins along the beach as they were beachcombing. And they did a little research and found out about this whole fleet of ships that had sank here off of Vero Beach, Florida.
The owner of the salvage license for the area believed the coins were from the Spanish treasure fleet that sank in 1715. By now, Mel's treasure hunting reputation had grown, and he was offered half the 1715 treasure if he could find it. For Mel, this was a dream come true. This was his chance to be a full-time treasure hunter, to turn professional. But it meant uprooting his wife and 4 children 2,600 miles from California to Florida. It was a huge gamble. He might find nothing and lose everything. But in 1963, Mel decided to bet everything he had to follow his dream. He gave himself 1 year to strike it rich.
They decided they would sell everything and go work for 1 year. And they convinced Fay Fields and 4 other guys all to come work for free for 1 year.
Mel came armed with a secret weapon: technology. Fay Fields, Mel's electronics expert, had miniaturized a World War II submarine detection device, the Fluxgate magnetometer. Its underwater sensor could detect iron and steel on the seabed. By locating an anchor or even a nail, Mel hoped the magnetometer would be a shipwreck finding machine. But Mel's first months in Florida looking for the Spanish 1715 fleet were disappointing. He had a big problem. The magnetometer worked, detecting iron clues, but when the divers went over the side to investigate, the water was so murky they couldn't see their hand in front of their face, let alone hunt for treasure.
Dad had a lot of great characteristics. He was an engineer to begin with, so he could always figure out how to solve a problem.
If Mel couldn't solve this problem, his new life as a professional treasure hunter would be over before it had even started. He set to work, finding a way for his divers to see.
My father had noticed that on the surface level, there was clear water. And he wanted to bring that clearness from the surface down to the bottom.
If he could figure a way to push the clear water down to the bottom, then it would make it easier for the divers to see the treasure.
Mel designed giant steel tubes that attached to the back of the boat to redirect the clear wash from the propellers down towards the seabed.
While the boat was anchored, he would put the boat in gear, and all the prop wash, or the water that was blowing through the propellers, would then be pushed down through the elbow of the tube to the bottom, bringing the clear water down.
Because of their shape, Mel called them mailboxes. No treasure hunter had ever tried anything like this.
It was a great device. It worked perfectly. It made it crystal clear.
Mel had solved the visibility problem. The divers could now see to investigate the magnetometer readings, clues to where the treasure ships had sunk. Quite by accident, Mel's mailbox also fixed another problem he didn't even know he had.
Turned out to have a really nice side effect of digging a big hole real fast.
The prop wash, forced through Mel's giant mailboxes, had scoured a wide hole 6 feet deep into the sand of the seabed.
What used to take about a month to do, we ended up doing in one day.
Mel had revolutionized treasure hunting. He was sure the source of all those beached silver and gold coins would soon be revealed by the mighty mailboxes. Day after day, he put them to work. But his initial success began to look more like beginner's luck. Weeks turned into months, with no sign of treasure. Mel could give himself just 1 year to make it as a professional treasure hunter. After 11 months' hard work, he had nothing but a huge hole in his bank balance. Time and money was running out. But Mel Fisher never lost hope. Just days from complete failure, his perseverance was rewarded.
He worked for 360 days without finding much. And on that day, the 360th day, they dug a hole and it was full of gold doubloons.
He said he'll never forget it. It was like the bottom was paved with gold coins.
Mel's mailboxes had uncovered a fortune. 1,033 gold coins, the greatest salvage haul ever recorded at that time.
So they never went back to California. They all moved to Florida permanently. They worked here on the 1715 fleet for the next 7 years, very successfully, found several of the wrecks, many hundreds, thousands of beautiful artifacts.
Mel Fisher was living his dream. He was a top professional treasure hunter. But he set his sights even higher.
He said, let's go after the biggest shipwreck on this side of the pond.
Mel Fisher now had enough money and expertise to launch a quest that would consume the rest of his life. The hunt for the ultimate sunken treasure ship. She was fabulously rich. $500 million in gold, silver, and emeralds had sunk off the Florida Keys, but no one knew where. And Mel was determined that he would find the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha. Mel's biggest problem was where to start looking. The Atocha was one of 8 ships in the 1622 treasure fleet that sank off the Florida Keys. But the Keys are a chain of thousands of small islands that stretch over 220 miles of ocean. Mel faced an impossible task. Except the Spanish had left one 300-year-old clue. In Seville, Spain, is the Archivo de Indias. Preserved here are the original records of Spain's South American trade in the 16th and 17th centuries.
The Spanish were very obsessed with writing down every possible thing that they could.
Mel had a copy of a 1620s document. It stated that the Atocha sank at the last key of the Matacumbis. For Mel, this was a great leap forward.
There were 3 islands in the Upper Keys, Upper, Middle, and Lower Matacumbi, so that's where he started the search in 1968.
Mel zeroed in on the Matacumbis using his proven magnetometer and mailbox techniques. His team of divers scoured the area.
They would have the maps out on the dining room table. All of the divers would be sitting around pointing at the maps and saying, well, what if the ships came in this direction? What if the storm was coming from that direction? There were thousands of theories.
For 3 years, they tried everything, but found nothing. No sign of the Atocha or her sister ships of the fleet lost in 1622. Not a coin, not even a nail. Treasure hunting is an expensive business, and Mel's money from the hoard of coins was all but spent chasing his dream of the Atocha. Even born optimist Mel Fisher struggled to believe the sunken treasure ship was there. Perhaps he had been crazy to try. Then, a chance meeting led to a breakthrough. When Mel met Florida historian Eugene Lyon in church one Sunday, he couldn't believe his luck. Eugene was going to Seville to study documents in the Archivo de Indias for his doctoral thesis.
He said, aha, please, for my sake, keep your eye on the Atocha, because that's the ship I've been after for a long while. I said, I will.
Ever the optimist, Mel hoped that somewhere in the 50 million time-stained pages of Spanish bureaucracy, Eugene would discover a clue to help find the Atocha. And amazingly, there was.
In there I found a small bundle wrapped with pink ribbon, which referred to the salvage of the Santa Margarita.
The galleon Santa Margarita was lost with the Atocha in the treasure fleet of 1622. But as she sank in shallow water, most of the people aboard survived. Eugene had discovered an eyewitness account that told how they'd watched the Atocha founder and sink in plain sight. Crucially for Mel, the fragile document gave a location.
I went right through it and found on the last worm-eaten page the statement that these ships were lost, that is, not only Atocha, but Santa Margarita in the Cayos del Marqués.
The Cayos del Marqués, or Marquesas Keys, lie over 100 miles southwest of the Matacumbis. No wonder Mel couldn't find the Atocha. He'd been looking in the wrong place. But now, surely, this eyewitness account put the Atocha within his grasp.
He believed he was certain to find it. He was determined and sure of his ability to find it.
With new hope, Mel set to work with his magnetometers looking for telltale iron clues to find the galleon. There was lots of iron, but his divers brought him only bad news.
The Navy has a target field out there, and we found over 5,000 bombs while we were looking for the Atocha. And that really slows you down, but you have to check every one of those targets.
Invariably turns out to be an old bomb casing, you know, or it could be a refrigerator, or it could be many hundreds or thousands of things that people have thrown overboard their ship. We found an old Volkswagen out there. We even found a train.
Month after month, Mel found metal junk, but no sign of the Atocha.
Every morning my father would say, today's the day. Just kept searching and searching. And Most people probably would have given up, but my father didn't. He was determined.
Mel had now spent over $200,000 searching and was desperately struggling to keep going.
It was really, really hard. There were a lot of times when it was, there was no money.
We would have fuel, but no money for food at all. Fuel was more important. Every one of us were expert spear fishermen at the time. And you had to like fish. You really had to like fish.
Without money to keep the boats fueled, Mel's quest for the Atocha's treasure was finished. To raise cash, he decided to sell shares in the treasure when he found it. But he could show not even one object from the Atocha. Investors steered clear.
It's always hard to get people to invest in something that almost seems like a dream. First of all, if it can be done, why hasn't it already been done? And if it hasn't already been done, is it real or is it just a story? So many people I just don't think believed it was true.
There was lots of people who didn't believe in us, who used to say, you know, we're just spending other people's money, getting a suntan, out here diving, having a great time.
During the summer of 1971, Mel Fisher towed his magnetometer over 175,000 miles of seabed. To get investment, he needed proof, hard evidence that the Atocha treasure was more than just a fantasy. Then suddenly, one diver found it.
The diver came up and he's yelling and screaming. He says, there's a huge encrusted anchor down there.
The diver's excitement told Mel this could be just the break he needed. But was the anchor from the Atocha?
It had the big flukes on it that came like that and then down, and the shaft on it was 17 feet, and it had a big ring around it.
So these giant rings like that to tie the ropes on.
The ring was so big, even with all of the incrustation, a diver could swim right through it. I mean, that's how big this thing was.
The divers saw by its design it was a Spanish galleon anchor. But only Mel was convinced he'd found the Atocha.
Do you know how many anchors like that are out in that area? Hundreds, if not thousands, right? But this one, Mel knew it was the Atocha.
Dad was sure this was the Atocha. You know, everybody else was like, well, you got an anchor, but you know, you don't know that's the Atocha. And he was sure, he was convinced.
Mel is, by the way, the world's greatest, biggest optimist.
But Mel's personal assurances would not pull in the investment he needed. He dived to look for supporting evidence. By the anchor lay small black blobs, encrusted silver coins.
When Mel brought up a coin and passed it to his wife, she sort of smeared her finger across it and said, "This is Spanish."
Stamped King Philip IV. It was about the right age, but the exact year was key. The Atocha sank in 1622, so a later dated coin would destroy Mel's claim to have found his treasure ship.
Mel said if we found any dated past 1622 to throw them overboard.
The coins were dated from 1616 to 1621.
This discovery kept Mel's dream alive. The anchor might indeed be from the Atocha. Next morning, Mel had the prop wash mailboxes blowing sand from around the anchor when a diver saw something glinting.
And as he hand fanned the sand, up popped a gold chain. And he held it up and he showed everybody on the boat. I mean, everybody was going crazy.
Mel was saved. He couldn't prove he'd found the Atocha, but the gold chain was undeniably treasure. He enjoyed using it, along with his infectious personality, to spread gold fever.
When he was trying to give somebody gold fever, he would take that chain off and just slowly dribble it into their hand and tell them how gold never tarnishes, it doesn't rust, it doesn't turn yellow, it just shines forever, as he slowly lowered the chain in their hand.
My father loved to see the look on people's face when he would take that 6-foot-long gold chain and dribble it into their hand. Now, he wouldn't let them put their arm on a table or on an armchair. He would make them hold their arm out into the air so you could see their hand going down because it was very heavy. And then at the last 6 or 8 inches, he would drop it. Everybody that put it on or held it in their hand smiled. And my dad loved to make people smile.
They'd grab that chain and they'd have gold fever. And then they might give us some money to go look for treasure.
With the gold chain and silver coins as evidence, potential investors began at last to believe that Mel Fisher might actually be on the trail of $500 million in gold, silver, and jewels. Mel did raise enough money to keep going, but anyone expecting a quick return would be disappointed.
It was like the Atocha would tease us. There was a little here, and we would think, oh, this is it. You know, we found the anchor, so, you know, the rest must be right around it. We'll just dig all around the anchor, and of course, it'll all be laying there. And it wasn't.
By examining the last moments of the Atocha in the hurricane of 1622, Mel hoped he'd find clues leading him to the riches in her hold. With masts torn down and rudder smashed, the wind and waves would push the galleon towards the reef.
They're totally helpless. You're at the mercy of the sea, and it'll do whatever it wants with you.
The last hope of the 265 people on board was to hold the Atocha's position roped to one of the galleon's huge anchors, hooked into the seabed.
They would throw out an anchor and try to get a bite, get the anchor hooked in and ride it out, and these lines would break on them.
To Mel, the anchor he discovered was like a signpost, literally pointing the way to the shipwreck.
It will tell you the direction of the ship and where it's sunk. Because wherever the flukes dig in, then opposite that would be where she was hanging on from the anchor.
The anchor pointed northwest, so when the rope parted, the galleon was driven by the weather to the southeast and sank.
You know, we figured, okay, we got the anchor, you know, now we're going to find the wreck. It's got to be close by. We just see which way the anchor's pointing and go there.
Full of hope, Mel's team worked methodically to the southeast. They found some silver pieces, and Mel's eldest son, Dirk, even uncovered a very rare navigator's astrolabe, amazingly still in working order. Week in, week out, Mel's mailboxes excavated hole after hole in the soft, shifting sand. But the fabled pile of treasure did not appear, just tantalizing clues.
These are all empty holes, and all of a sudden we came across all this purple represents silver coins. There's quite a few coins were found right there, and this orange represents lead musket balls. More empty holes than anything.
Ever the optimist, Mel would always put a positive spin on things.
So we dug another empty hole, but he said, well, that's not an empty hole. That's another place you know where the treasure's not.
You're making a huge ocean just that little bit smaller.
So you're getting one step closer to the treasure.
For 3 years, Mel's mailboxes made sandy holes on the sea floor, finding pottery oil jars, muskets, swords, daggers and only a few coins. But Mel never lost heart.
You know, you dig so many empty holes, but then every once in a while there's one full of treasure. And that's when it all pays off.
In one day, the 25th of May 1973, just 200 yards from the anchor, Mel's team recovered 1,460 Spanish silver coins. So many, they named the site the Bank of Spain. Crucially, no coin was dated later than 1621. Might this actually be the treasure from the Atocha? Mel was about to find out. In July 1973, historian Eugene Lyon got a call from Mel's office. The latest find was something new, and they needed his expertise.
We found 3 of these silver bars that are about the size of a loaf of bread, and they're about 80 pounds each.
The 3 ingots' value as bullion is about $100,000, but their value to Mel was far greater. Each ingot was stamped with a Roman numeral, its unique serial number. If they matched the galleon's records, they'd prove once and for all whether Mel had really found the Atocha.
I went over to see the 3 silver bars. So I leaned down and I took down the numbers of the bars. I said, "This looks good, Mel," and he said, "It is good."
From the Archivo de Indias in Seville, Eugene had the microfilm rolls of the Atocha's original ship's manifest. Her official cargo was listed, including 40 tons of silver, 901 ingots, each with its serial number. He scanned line after line, page after page of missing treasure, looking for a match.
Then I put on the reel for the Atocha. I got to the numbers of the bars, and there they were. It's the Atocha.
Mel had triumphed, convinced the skeptics, and silenced his detractors.
From that point on, we knew that, we had the Atocha, without a doubt.
The ship's manifest also revealed that 3 silver bars was just a tiny fraction of the Atocha's motherlode of treasure. There were 898 more bars and gold and jewels out there somewhere. What Mel didn't realize was that the galleon's treasure lay scattered and buried over miles of seabed. The line southeast from the anchor to the Bank of Spain was clear. Mel was sure a trail of artifacts would soon lead him to the Atocha's motherlode. He pictured a long wall of 900 silver bars, topped by the ship's fallen bronze cannons.
He knew that if we found the cannons, we'd probably find the rest of the ship, because all the previous wrecks we worked, the cannons were all right on top of the main pile.
Mel knew from the Atocha's original documents that on deck above the silver bars, she carried 22 of the prized bronze cannons.
The bronze cannons could shoot farther with more accuracy than most of the other guns of the day. So they were very expensive, and they weren't on all ships. They were only on the most valuable ships.
But in all his years of treasure hunting, Mel had never found one.
I remember him telling me he chased down probably 1,000 bronze cannon stories. And he was really, truly beginning to wonder if bronze cannons had ever been made, because every one of them turned out to be iron.
To the diver who could find him an Atocha bronze cannon, Mel offered a $10,000 reward. Year after year, Mel continued mailbox excavations along the southeast trail of Atocha debris. Mile after mile of largely empty holes, he found no sign of a cannon or the hoped-for motherlode.
It is, you know, the cliche looking for a needle in a haystack, but I think it's even harder than that because the haystack is 10 miles long. It's not just a stack of hay, it's a 10-mile-long pile of hay.
By July 1975, Mel's son Dirk, now captain of the dive boat Northwind, had had enough of creeping along the seabed and decided to strike out on a hunch.
Dirk had an idea that if you lined up the anchor with the Bank of Spain and just followed that line out to sea, that you should be able to find the Atocha main pile. And he decided, well, I'm gonna just skip this whole space and jump way out there.
Diver and underwater cameraman Pat Klein was aboard the Northwind with Dirk.
So he sticks on his mask and fins, and he dives down, and all of a sudden we hear this scream. And the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is, there's sharks out there, they got them. But when you look closer, you see him doing this, oh, over here, over here. He had the biggest smile on his face you'd ever seen. And now we're able to hear him yelling, cannons, cannons. We've got cannons down here. Sure enough, when we got down there, there were these 5 beautiful bronze cannons sitting right on top of each other.
Dad was on cloud 9. Finally got his bronze cannons.
Mel believed he was just a step away from the richest salvage haul ever recorded.
Oh yeah, we thought for sure that was it. We'd hit the big pile, and the next day we were gonna find the rest.
But just as Mel and his team were celebrating Dirk's triumph, disaster struck. The fishers had a shipwreck of their own. The Northwind sank in the night. Dirk, his wife Angel, and diver Rick Gage all drowned. Mel had paid dearly for his dreams of treasure.
If there was ever a time in the entire search for the Atocha where my father might have thought, ever even considered about giving up, it would have been right after the tragedy with Dirk and Angel's death.
In their grief, Mel and his family stopped the search for the sunken treasure and thought long and hard about whether to continue at all.
You know, Dirk gave us a great clue by finding those bronze cannons, and it pointed us in the right direction of where to go look for the main pile.
It was his life's work, so yes, of course we would go on.
2 months passed before Mel was ready to restart the hunt for the riches of the Atocha as a memorial.
It actually increased our determination. We're going to find it for Dirk.
Mel raised the Atocha's bronze cannons, expecting to find the motherlode of 900 silver bars underneath, or maybe close by. But there was no sign. Mel's treasure trail was well established. Southeast from the anchor to the Bank of Spain and onto the cannons. Surely Mel just had to keep following the trail.
Every time we'd get logical, like, okay, we got this, now this lines up. We found the anchors, we found the Bank of Spain, we found the cannons. Oh, there's nothing. It should be there, but it's not.
Years passed as Mel kept looking for the motherlode, and all the time the Atocha was teasing him with beautiful artifacts.
We found 27 pieces of this beautiful gold belt with jewels in it, 300 feet apart, over a period of a week. It was kind of like a little trail saying, here I am, come and get me.
The Atocha teased Mel for 8 more years as each new trail petered out. Then, a ray of hope. In 1983, Mel's son Kane and diver Andy Matrosi had found a long trail of artifacts thrown from the Atocha as she was torn apart by the hurricane.
One day we found an iron square spike from the Atocha. So I plotted that on the chart and drew a line back to the cannons. And that started what we called our line.
This new trail was off to one side of the established line.
We found a barrel hoop with a couple coins encrusted to it, some big ballast stones, and then all of a sudden copper ingots.
Andy and fellow diver Greg worked along the new trail for 2.5 years. Could the mother lode really be at the end of it?
And we found hundreds of silver coins, silver plates, more copper ingots, silver spoons, a wonderful variety of treasure. Now we're flying high now.
The next day, July the 20th, 1985, Andy Matrosi made a dive he would remember for the rest of his life.
All I saw was ripply sand, nothing of any interest. I had turned around and I felt a thumping on my shoulder. And it wasn't just a, hey, he was hitting me hard. And I turned around and looked at Greg and I saw his face. And his eyes were popping out of his head. And I thought, I know what you just saw. Show me what you just saw. Was a wall that stood like 3 foot tall. It went for 75 feet and was about 20 feet wide, was the mother lode of the Atocha. And that what I was looking at was silver bars.
This time, it wasn't just 2 or 3 silver bars, but hundreds, just as Mel had imagined.
I went over, touched one, and I picked up the first bar of silver and held it to about my knees and felt how heavy it was. And that was like pinching yourself in a dream, picking that bar up. And you just wanted to swim up to the surface and shout it out to the world, what we had just found.
This was the moment Mel Fisher had been dreaming of for over 16 years. But how could he know today was finally the day?
When they radioed in that they had found the treasure, Dad wasn't around.
They couldn't find him. They had been trying to call him. Where is Mel? We found, we've got to tell Mel.
We couldn't reach him, so we went out looking for him.
In blissful ignorance of the momentous news, he had gone shopping and stopped off for a quiet drink. At the office, the whole team was ready to celebrate. They had found the treasure, but they couldn't find Mel.
We just finally called the radio station and said, Mel, they found the mother lode. He's got to come to work right now. He's carrying his dive gear with under an umbrella and walking through the rain up to the front of the museum, which is now bubbling, bursting at the seams of people. And photographers and the local reporters were all already there. It was pretty much chaos from that moment on.
He had a smile on his face for about a week. It didn't go away.
Here we are in July 20th, exactly 10 years to the death of my brother. And Kane called on the radio and said, Dad, put the charts away, I've got it. I've got the mother lode.
And it was actually 10 years to the day of the accident that we found the main pile. So I think he was up there helping us.
I got to be the individual to tell Mel what his dream looked like.
Hello, Mel. Got a pile of silver bars, and it's like a reef. There's bars scattered all in the reef.
And I said, it's more beautiful than you ever told us it would look like, Mel.
We were kind of awestruck at first. I've been doing it most of my life, looking for this one wreck. And all of a sudden, there it was. The initial reaction was, what are we going to do now, you know?
And it was still kind of surreal, hard to believe. Because after hearing Today's the Day every day for 17 years, it kind of is like a boy crying wolf.
Mel told a reporter, "Today it looks like we came to the end of the rainbow and saw the pot of gold."
Everybody wanted to shake your hand. Everybody wanted to give you a hug. Everybody wanted a free piece of treasure. Got any gold coins you're giving away today? There was people claiming to be related to me that I had never met in my entire life.
The legendary wealth of the Atocha was true, and she was as rich as Mel said she would be. Over $500 million.
Dad is one of the few people who have accomplished their dreams in their lifetime.
Mel Fisher was the most successful treasure hunter in the world.
This one is 88 pounds.
Ooh, that's a big one.
In just a few months, Mel had over 80,000 pounds of silver and gold, 30 chests full of silver coins, and 350 uncut emeralds piled up in his museum. The problem was, no bank would take so much silver.
In the first year, we had this whole museum, this whole floor, with stacks of silver bars. We could only stack them about 5 deep because otherwise it would break through the floor.
Mel Fisher followed his dreams, succeeded in his quest, and lived to enjoy his good fortune. He died in 1998, surrounded by his family. He never stopped working on the Atocha, as he believed there was twice as much treasure left undiscovered. His family continues his treasure hunt today.
We're still looking for the rest of the mother lode that we haven't found yet.
Once again, working on clues left by the Spanish might lead them to unimaginable riches.
Dad was sure there would be emeralds on the Atocha. He had seen a copy of a letter that this fella in the New World wrote his brother back in Spain saying he had put a 70-pound box on board. So far, we found about 6 pounds. So there's another 64 pounds at least out there. Just that one box of emeralds is worth $1 billion. And I'm sure there's more than one box.
To me, it's something I always say is you just got to keep looking, and we'll find it.
It's out there. We're just going to go find it. And I think we're going to find it today. Today's the day.